Hundreds of years ago, in the dense forests and rolling hills of what we now call Richland County, Wisconsin, a young indigenous warrior was walking with purpose toward the center of his village. He was a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, a proud and resilient people who had called this beautiful land home for generations. The warrior was strong and brave, one of the best hunters in his tribe, and he had been summoned by his tribal chief. As he walked, the familiar sounds of village life surrounded him, but a sense of unease hung in the air. He had a strong suspicion about why the chief wanted to see him, and when he arrived at the village center, his fears were confirmed. Standing there with the chief were 9 of the other strongest and most capable men of the tribe. They stood quietly, their faces serious. The warrior knew immediately this was about the 3 missing boys. 2 days earlier, 3 teenagers from the village, boys on the cusp of manhood, had gone out into the wilds on a deer hunt. It was a rite of passage, a chance to prove their skills and contribute to the tribe. But they hadn't returned. 48 hours had passed, a full 2 suns had set, and there was still no sign of them. Their families were growing more and more frantic with each passing hour. They had pleaded with the tribal chief to send a search party, their voices filled with a desperate worry that was starting to infect the entire village. The chief had initially been hesitant. It wasn't completely out of the ordinary for hunting parties, even young ones, to be gone for a couple of days. The forest was vast, and a good hunt could take time. But the families insisted they had a bad feeling, a deep, gnawing sense that something was terribly wrong. Finally, after 2 full days of waiting, the chief agreed. It was time to act. And so, here was the young warrior standing before his chief and the 9 other men. The chief looked at him with trust and respect and asked him to lead the search effort. He would be in charge of this party of 10, responsible for finding the boys and bringing them home safely. In truth, the warrior felt it might be a bit of an overreaction. 10 of the tribe's best men for 3 teenagers who were probably just fine, maybe a little lost or extending their trip to seem more impressive. But he would never question the chief's command or disrespect the family's fear. He accepted the duty without hesitation. Of course, he would go. The 10 men gathered their supplies. They took their most reliable bows, quivers full of arrows, and sharp spears. They packed dried meat and skins filled with fresh water, not knowing how long the search might take. They said their goodbyes to the anxious villagers who had gathered to see them off. The air was heavy with hope and fear. Then, as one, the 10 warriors left the village, following the well-worn path that all hunters took when they ventured out into the great forest. The lead warrior was a master tracker. His eyes could read the forest floor like a storybook. Almost immediately, he picked up the trail of the 3 teenage boys. He could see their distinct footprints in the soft earth, and for a moment, he felt a wave of relief. This would be simple. They would follow the tracks, find the boys camped out somewhere, give them a stern lecture about worrying their families, and then guide them back to the village. It would all be over by nightfall. But as they followed the trail, the story the tracks told began to change. The footprints continued along the main path for a while, but then they suddenly veered off. They left the familiar trail and headed deep into a part of the forest that wasn't known for good hunting. This was the first thing that felt wrong. The Ho-Chunk people knew these woods intimately. They knew where the deer herds moved, where the best hunting grounds were. The path the boys had taken was leading them away from all of it. It made no sense. The lead warrior kept his growing concerns to himself, not wanting to alarm the others. He just kept his head down, focused on the tracks. They walked for miles, deeper and deeper into the wilderness. And as they walked, he noticed something else that was deeply unsettling. The tracks never stopped. There were no signs that the boys had paused to rest. There were no marks in the dirt to suggest they had stopped to set a snare or stood still to aim an arrow at a deer. Their footprints just went on and on in a straight, determined line as if they were on a mission marching towards some specific, unknown destination. After hours of relentless hiking, with the sun beginning to dip lower in the sky, the search party still hadn't found the boys. They found themselves standing at the edge of a steep, rocky ravine. As they looked down into the shadowy depths, they all realized they had traveled so far off the beaten path that they were now in truly uncharted territory. None of them, not even the most experienced hunters among them, had ever been to this place before. They had no idea what lay at the bottom of the ravine or what was beyond it. But they knew one thing for sure. The tracks of the three teenage boys led directly down the steep slope and into the ravine. There was no hesitation. They had to follow. So, carefully, the 10 warriors made their way down the treacherous incline. When they reached the bottom, the dense canopy of trees opened up into a small clearing. And there, right in front of them, was the dark, gaping mouth of a cave. The tracks led straight to it. They went into the blackness, but there were no tracks coming back out. For reasons they could not possibly understand, the three boys had hiked all this way into this unknown place and had walked into this cave. And they were, presumably, still inside. The warrior and his men approached the entrance cautiously, the air growing colder as they got closer. Even standing right at the mouth of the cave, they couldn't see anything. It was a void of absolute darkness. It was clearly large enough to walk into, but how far it went or where it led was a complete mystery. They called out the boys' names, but only the flat, dead echo of their own voices came back. A heavy sense of apprehension fell over the lead warrior. He didn't know this cave. He didn't know if the boys were hurt or lost, or if something else was in there with them. A bear, a mountain lion, or something worse. He had to be smart. He couldn't risk his whole team. He made a decision. He turned to 2 of his men and instructed them to go inside to scout it out. The other 7 men would wait with him at the entrance. The 2 chosen warriors nodded, and without a word, they stepped into the darkness and disappeared from sight. The 8 men waiting outside stood in total silence, listening. They could hear the voices of the 2 scouts echoing from within the cave as they called out the names of the missing teenagers. Their calls grew fainter and more distorted the deeper they went. From the outside, the group could only see the flickering light from the scouts' torches for a short distance before they seemed to be swallowed by the dark. Then, at the exact moment their light vanished, their voices stopped. The cave went completely, utterly silent. For 5 long minutes, the warrior and the others stood there, waiting, their anxiety growing with every passing second. What was happening in there? The silence was unnatural. 10 minutes went by. Then 15. Still, not a single sound came from the cave. It was as if the darkness had consumed the 2 men whole. The warrior couldn't wait any longer. He told the others to stay put and carefully stepped just inside the entrance of the cave himself. The air was frigid. He began calling out the names of the 2 men he had just sent in. His voice echoed through what felt like a vast empty space, but there was no reply. At least, not at first. Just as he was about to call out again, he heard something. It was a faint sound, coming from deep, deep within the cave. It sounded like a low, mournful wail. At first, he thought it was a single voice, but then it seemed to multiply, as if other voices were layering on top of each other, creating a strange, discordant harmony. And then, with a sudden, chilling realization, the warrior understood what he was hearing. It wasn't a wail of pain, it was a chant. And it was a chant he knew all too well. It was the death song. It was the sacred, final chant a Ho-Chunk warrior sings only when he knows he is about to die. The moment the other 7 men outside heard it, they knew exactly what it was, too. They surged forward to the mouth of the cave, their faces masks of alarm. "We have to go in," one of them said. "They're in trouble." Something is wrong. Before the lead warrior could give an order, before he could form a plan, 6 of the 7 men charged into the cave. Their loyalty to their brothers overrode everything else. They ran headlong into the darkness, their own voices now echoing as they called out, chasing the sound of that terrible final song. The lead warrior and the 1 man who had stayed back with him stood frozen at the entrance, listening to the chaos. They heard the 6 men running and yelling, their sounds mixing with the haunting reverberation of the death song. And then, Just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The chanting ceased. The yelling stopped. The cave was plunged back into that same profound, eerie silence. The lead warrior and the last remaining man were alone, their hearts pounding in their chests. They listened, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. Just quiet. And then it began again. The rhythmic chanting. The death song. But this time, it was different. It was no longer just a couple of voices. It was a chorus. Dozens of voices, it seemed, all layered on top of each other, chanting the death song in a powerful rhythmic wave of sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. The sound poured out of the cave, a horrifying announcement of death on a scale he couldn't comprehend. At that moment, the lead warrior faced an impossible choice. Every part of his being, every rule of their warrior code, screamed at him to go in there, to fight for his men, to die with them if he had to. But another part of him, a logical, cold part, knew the truth. Something evil was happening inside that cave. If he and the last man went in, they would not come out. Their story would die with them. No one would ever know what happened. And so, in an act that went against every fiber of his soul, he made a decision. As the death song echoed all around them, he and the other man turned their backs on the cave and they ran. They ran for miles, not stopping, not looking back, fueled by terror and grief. They ran all the way back to their village, arriving long after nightfall, breathless and on the verge of collapse. They found the tribal chief and told him everything that had happened. The chief listened, his face grim. He declared that at first light they would all go back. The entire village. They would go back to that cave and they would get their people out. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced the forest canopy, a massive group assembled. The tribal chief, the lead warrior, the other survivor, and nearly 100 other members of the tribe, men and women, banded together. They marched out into the wilderness, a somber and determined procession, retracing the steps back to the ravine, back to that cursed cave. When they arrived, the cave was just as they had left it. It was quiet. The tracks leading in were still there, undisturbed. There were still no tracks leading out. Everyone they had lost was still inside. But this time, they had a plan. The lead warrior didn't know how they could possibly succeed, but the chief was confident. He addressed the crowd, his voice steady. "We will not go in as small groups," he announced. "We will not be separated. We will go as one. We will lock hands, all of us, and form a great line. We will never let go of the person next to us. We will walk into that cave together, as one body, and we will find our people." It seemed like a brilliant idea. There was strength in their numbers, strength in their unity. Nothing could happen to them if they were all connected. So, the great human chain was formed. The warrior who had survived the previous day was placed at the very front of the line. The lead warrior was second, his hand gripping the first man's tightly. Behind him, stretching all the way out of the cave, was a line of nearly 100 people, all holding on to each other. When everyone was ready, they began to move forward, a single shuffling entity stepping into the cold darkness. They walked slowly, cautiously. After about 50 feet, the cave passage made a sharp turn to the right. As the front of the line rounded the corner, they were plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. No light from the entrance could reach this far. The lead warrior couldn't see a thing, not even his own hand in front of his face. All he could feel was the tight grip of the man in front of him and the man behind him. He squeezed their hands back, a silent promise that they were in this together. The man at the front of the line kept calling out the names of the lost, his voice swallowed by the immense blackness. As they shuffled deeper, the walls of the cave seemed to press in on them, the air growing thick and heavy. And then they heard it. From somewhere in the deep, the death song began again. It started low, a soft, rhythmic chant, but it grew steadily in volume and intensity until it was a booming, deafening chorus that echoed off the walls and vibrated in their chests. Panic began to ripple down the line, but there was nowhere to go. They were deep inside, trapped in the dark, with that horrible sound. The lead warrior held on as tightly as he could, trying to be an anchor of calm for the others. He tried to keep moving forward. But then, he felt it. The hand of the man in front of him, the leader of the line, suddenly went slack. It just slipped out of his grasp. The lead warrior lunged forward into the blackness, his hand grabbing at empty air. The man was gone. There was no scream, no sound of a fall, nothing. He had simply vanished. The lead warrior was now at the front of the line. He wanted to stop, to scream for everyone to turn back, but he felt a strange, irresistible force pulling him forward, deeper into the cave. It was a compulsion he couldn't fight. And then, to his absolute horror, he felt his own mouth open. He heard his own voice, completely against his will, join the terrible, chanting chorus of the death song. At that moment, chaos erupted. The human chain broke. People screamed in terror, letting go of each other, turning and scrambling blindly back towards where they thought the entrance was. It was a stampede of pure panic in the suffocating darkness. Minutes later, the survivors stumbled out of the cave, gasping and crying, blinking in the daylight. The tribal chief, who had remained outside, rushed to calm them. He quickly did a head count, and his heart sank. Over a dozen more people were gone. They had not come out. And the cave, which moments before had been filled with screams and the sound of the death song, was once again completely, unnervingly silent. The chief now knew, for certain, there was an evil spirit in that cave, something that fed on his people. He made a solemn declaration. No one from their tribe would ever step foot in that place again. They could not lose anyone else. The cave was not a place of mystery. It was a tomb. And so, they sealed it. They worked for hours, rolling massive boulders, piling rocks and dirt, until the entrance was completely blocked, hidden from the world forever. Centuries passed. The story of the cave that swallowed warriors was passed down from generation to generation. For the Ho-Chunk people, it became a legend, a terrifying campfire story to warn children about the dangers of the woods. Many who heard it wondered if it was real, or just folklore meant to scare them. They would never know for sure. Fast forward to the year 1930. A man named Paul Seafort, a well-known antique dealer in Richland County, Wisconsin, had a passion for hiking and history. He loved to explore the deep woods, searching for indigenous artifacts left behind by tribes like the Ho-Chunk Nation. One day, while hiking far off any established trail, he came across a secluded ravine. He climbed down, and on the far side, he noticed a strange pile of rocks. It looked unnatural, like a man-made mound, covered in moss and overgrown with grass. His curiosity got the better of him. He walked over and started pulling some of the rocks away. He quickly realized this was no random pile. These boulders had been placed here deliberately for a reason. After clearing away enough of them, he uncovered what they were hiding, the dark opening to a cave. He knew he had found something special. It took a lot more work, but he finally managed to create an opening just big enough to squeeze through. He was sure that a sealed cave like this must hold incredible artifacts inside. He went home and gathered supplies, including a strong lantern, and returned another day. He squeezed through the opening he'd made and entered the cave. He walked down the initial passage until he came to the sharp right turn. He followed it, and soon the ceiling began to get lower and lower, forcing him to crouch. He was so determined to see what was inside that he kept going. Even when the passage became so tight, he had to crawl on his belly, pushing the lantern ahead of him. Just as he was about to turn back, thinking it was a dead end, he slid under one last low-hanging rock, and the space suddenly opened up. He stood up and held his lantern high. He was in a massive, cathedral-like cavern. The beam of his lantern cut through the darkness, and what he saw made him freeze. The floor of the cavern was covered with human skeletons. But they weren't scattered about. They were arranged in dozens of neat, orderly rows. And they were all positioned in the exact same way, kneeling with their arms stretched out over their heads as if they were bowing or praying in unison. There were so many of them he couldn't even begin to count them all. He stood there in stunned silence, his light trembling in his hand. He slowly moved the beam of the lantern in the direction that all the skeletons were facing. And there, at the far end of the cavern, he saw what they were all bowing to. Carved directly out of the stone wall of the cave was an enormous, imposing chair. A throne. And the throne was empty. The sight of those kneeling skeletons and that vacant throne filled Paul Seafort with a deep primal fear. He forgot all about artifacts. He forgot about history. He just knew he had to get out. He turned and scrambled back through the narrow passage as fast as he could, not looking back, and fled the cave. He later told his incredible story to a journalist at the Milwaukee Journal, and it was published, creating a permanent record of his discovery. But the article and Paul's account left the world with two chilling, unanswered questions. What truly happened to all of those people inside that cave? And more importantly, who, or what, was sitting on that throne? We may never know what happened to those warriors inside the cave. But one question still remains. Who were all those skeletons bowing to? Until next time. In the year 2025, on June 29th, a woman by the name of June Baxter, who was 83 years old at the time, made her way slowly down the hallway of her simple home in Attleborough, which is a small town located in the eastern region of England. Her passing occurred at approximately 8:20 in the morning, according to the exact time. She suffered from a number of medical conditions that caused her to be rather fragile. As a result of these conditions, she was required to keep one hand on the wall in order to maintain her balance or stability while she was walking. For her to be able to walk, this was an essential requirement. Despite the difficulties she faced on a physical level, June placed a larger focus on her independence than she did on anything else. This was the case regardless of the circumstances. This was something that she was extremely excited to continue doing, despite the fact that her family believed that she was taking a little bit of a risk by continuing to live on her own in her own house. She was really eager to continue having this experience. During the time when June, her husband, and their cherished little puppy were all living in this house together, there was a period of time when they were all living there together. It was a pattern that was comfortable, there was a lot of life going on, and the house was full of people going about their everyday lives. From the flip side of the coin, it is important to note that her spouse had been diagnosed with a serious illness around 7 years before to this event. Because his illness required a big amount of care and attention, June and he were forced to make the painful decision of entrusting their dog to their granddaughter during this period of time. This decision was made because of the fact that his condition required a significant amount of care and attention. To put it another way, they were not able to successfully manage the responsibility of taking care of a pet while simultaneously monitoring his health. In spite of the fact that it was a particularly sad day, they arrived at the conclusion that it was the most prudent choice. June's husband passed away almost soon after that, and the house was suddenly filled with an awful sense of emptiness. June's spouse had been dying for quite some time. Only she was the only one who was by herself. On the other hand, the fact that she was within the confines of the house by herself did not necessarily imply that she was completely cut off from the rest of the world. The woman who had taken in her dog was not only her granddaughter, but also her grandchild, and she lived in close proximity to her the entire time. June was a constant presence in her life, and anytime she entered her environment, she welcomed her with open arms. June was a constant presence in her life. She would nearly always bring June's aged dog along with her on her regular visits. This was something that she did virtually every time. This is the manner in which she would conduct herself the vast majority of the time. Throughout those exchanges, June maintained an attitude that was one of complete and full joy. As she gazed at her dog and felt the familiar fur of her dog under her fingertips, she experienced a sense of comfort that was impossible to put into words. She felt a sense of comfort at the same time. The fact that she was thinking about her puppy allowed her to be successful in achieving this goal. Not only did June's granddaughter provide her happiness, but she also went out of her way to save her in a number of different ways. June cherished her grandchild above all else in the world. In no way, shape, or form did she ever find herself in a situation in which she was unable to offer June support with the practical duties that had become rather challenging for her. She would be responsible for performing the weekly grocery shopping, picking up her prescriptions, and picking up her meds from the pharmacy, in addition to transporting her to and from each of her doctor's appointments. In addition, she would be responsible for taking her to and from hospital appointments. Her granddaughter had made it abundantly clear on multiple occasions that all June needed to do was call, and she would be there instantly without any questions being asked. This was the only thing that June needed to do. June simply needed to provide this one command in order to complete the task. June, who had a personality that was fiercely independent, made every attempt to avoid imposing an excessive amount of dependence on her granddaughter. This was despite the fact that June had a personality that was fiercely independent. By any stretch of the imagination, she had no intention of being a burden to anyone. The most essential thing for her was to demonstrate to herself that she was still capable of standing on her own and handling things. She was mostly driven by this motivation. Something that she could look back on with a great deal of pride was the moment in question. Therefore, on this particular morning, she was simply concentrating on her routine daily ritual as she made her way down the hallway, her hand following the pattern of the wallpaper for the purpose of keeping stability. She was doing this because she was trying to keep her balance. For the very first time in her life, she turned around and went into the restroom, which was a room that she had been to a great number of times all during her existence. Without a shadow of a doubt, she never wavered from her decision. When compared to the previous instance, however, this time around, different circumstances prevailed. The moment her foot made contact with the cool tile floor, it slipped out from beneath her and she fell to the ground. The occurrence took place precisely at that precise instant. There was no opportunity to take advantage of anything that was accessible at this time, and it was not possible to provide a response at this moment in time. As she was falling, the sharp corner of the toilet counter made a forceful contact with the side of her leg, which caused her to sustain major injuries. A major injury was sustained by her as a result of this act. As a consequence of this, she began to fall more and further into the depression. The guy experienced pain that was both instantaneous and terrible right away. Even though she let out a scream, the sound was muffled by the walls of her house, which were completely barren of any residents. Despite this, she was able to hear the sound. It was nearly impossible for anyone to pick up on her voice. Only when she looked down did she notice that a lengthy cut on her leg was beginning to flow the first few droplets of blood. She was surprised to find out that the cut was bleeding. Following a little amount of time, the first sensations of shock and pain were rapidly replaced by a cold surge of anxiety brought on by the unknown. Indeed, this was the conclusion. It was the same situation that she had always been concerned about, the one that her family had cautioned her about when she was younger, and it was the same situation that she was now confronted with. When she was by herself and there was no one to assist her, she took a significant amount of harm and suffered a great deal of pain. However, she was also hurt. Despite the fact that she had always insisted on living by herself, she had never really given much thought to what she would do in the case of a significant emergency. She had never really given much thought to what she would do either. What she would do was something that she had never really given much thought to before. As far as she was concerned, her primary purpose was to protect herself from getting wounded as much as possible. She was attempting to avoid getting wounded in any way. On the other hand, this method had not shown any signs of producing any noticeable results. The fortunate circumstance for June was that she did not completely lack a safety net. This was a fortunate circumstance for her. In the aftermath of the passing of her husband, her granddaughter insisted on having a network of emergency call bells put in every room of the house. One of her goals was to have this particular action carried out The majority of the time, these were straightforward electrical gadgets that comprised of a cord that was suspended from the ceiling. It would immediately send a notification to the phone that belonged to her granddaughter whenever the line was withdrawn as soon as it was pulled. In addition to that, it would get in touch with the emergency services in the area. The bells were discovered in the restroom of the building, which was one of the locations included in the investigation. June was attempting to ignore the throbbing pain in her leg while she was lying on the floor. She reached up and clutched for the ceiling as she attempted to concentrate on the agony. With a sense of relief, she pulled on the thread with all of her effort when she had discovered it by her hand. She was relieved to have found the thread. There was a 10-minute stretch of time that separated the two periods. After what seemed like an eternity, time seemed to continue to pass. While June remained on the floor of the restroom, she was using a hand towel to apply pressure to the incision on her leg. She was doing this in an effort to slow down the rate at which she was bleeding. That same instant, she was finally able to hear the sound that she had been eagerly anticipating. The front door of her house opened. She had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Only a few moments later, she became aware of her granddaughter's voice, which was filled with concern as she called her name. She was concerned about her grandchild. Concerned about her grandchild, she did not feel well. June made an effort to call her back and let her know where she was located, but her voice was a little muffled. At the same time, she let her know where she was. In the span of a fraction of a second, her granddaughter materialized in the vicinity of the entranceway to the restroom. In addition to this, June's senior dog was following her around and walking directly behind her, pushing past her legs as she went about her regular chores. During the time that June was lying on the ground, both of them were able to see the blood that was on her face as well as the expression of misery that was on her face. It would have been impossible to ignore the worry that her granddaughter was expressing with her words. At the time that she was given the warning, she could not have possibly thought that the cut would be as severe as it actually was. On the other hand, June experienced a profound sense of comfort when she saw her granddaughter standing there, and when she saw her dog coming over to her with its tail wagging nervously. Both of these sensations brought her a sense of relief. Her attention was drawn back to the here and now by both of these occurrences. No matter how severe the cut was, it was of no consequence, whatever the severity of the cut was. It was possible to obtain assistance. At first, it appeared as though everything was going to be well on its own. Almost immediately, her dog came up to her and began gently exploring her palm while murmuring in a low voice. It was as if it had detected that something was very wrong with her. At first glance, it appeared as though it had found out that something was definitely not right. June started to feel a little bit more at ease while her granddaughter was frantically searching through the cupboards in the bathroom for bandages and disinfectant. This occurred when June's granddaughter was seeking for these items. During the time that she was stretching out with a hand that was shaking, she began to pat her dog, who was obviously quite concerned about her. The connection that they had remained just as strong as it had been in the past, despite the fact that a considerable period of time had elapsed since they had first met. The dog's presence on the premises brought a significant degree of comfort to the individuals who were there. After a certain amount of time had passed, her granddaughter was able to successfully locate a first aid kit and eventually found her way back to the house. Bandages were placed over the wound in a secure manner with the purpose of protecting it after the wound had been thoroughly cleaned to the best of her ability during the process. By the time the paramedics arrived a few minutes later, June's mental state had greatly improved, and the most of the bleeding had stopped by that point. June's condition had also significantly improved on its own. June's condition was also showing significant signs of improvement at the same time for her. There was no doubt that the soreness in her leg continued to exist, but the presence of her granddaughter and her dog had brought about a significant change in the conditions. When the paramedics entered the crowded restroom, they brought their equipment with them, which resulted in the space becoming more crowded than it had been before. When they were squatting down to evaluate her injury, they did so in a manner that was both professional and empathetic. This was the case throughout the entire process. They began by carefully removing the improvised bandage that her granddaughter had applied to the region before proceeding to remove it for good. They did this in order to get a better look at the wound that was causing them discomfort. A reassuring smile formed on the face of one of them as they looked up at June while they were in the process of finishing the thorough cleaning. As a result of the facts that he revealed with her, she was given the impression that it was significantly more dreadful than it actually was. It was a reduction that, when everything was taken into consideration, was not quite that big. The assertion that he made was that she would not even require stitches under any circumstances. They suggested that she keep it clean and possibly have her granddaughter stay for a limited period of time in order to reduce the likelihood of her falling again. The purpose of this was to prevent her from falling again in the future. On the other hand, the medical professionals stated that she was in perfect, healthy condition. They did not display any signs that there was a cause for concern. When the paramedics were in the process of gathering their belongings and leaving the premises that they were in, June expressed her gratitude to them after they had completed their duties. It was a little time in which she, her granddaughter, and the dog were all sitting together on the floor of the restroom, and during that brief moment, there was an emotion of collective thankfulness that permeated the ambiance. They were under the impression that they had been able to avoid being struck by a gunshot. There is a possibility that the fall had a lot more devastating consequences than what was initially thought. Not just a shattered hip, but also a brain injury that was acquired throughout the incident. When I was just left with a small cut on my leg, it felt like a fortunate escape from the situation that I was previously in. When June awoke the following morning in her bed, she was immediately aware that something was wrong. August, on the other hand, was not conscious of anything at all. Her boyfriend had been the one she had been sleeping with. Despite the fact that she was merely lying there, she felt sick to her stomach since her heart was beating so hard against her ribs the entire time. In spite of the fact that she had not even sat up yet, she was experiencing nausea and vomiting. She was experiencing emotions of lightheadedness and dizziness, and she also got the impression that the room was softly spinning. She was also experiencing a feeling of lightheadedness. She was completely covered in a layer of sweat that was everywhere on her body. This was in no way typical in any way, shape, or form. A horrific experience for everyone involved was the fact that this had never happened before in the history of the world. Her granddaughter had remained at the spot for a few hours after the paramedics had left the previous day, after they had left the scene. During the time that they were having their conversation, they performed a number of things, including drinking tea, making sure that June was comfortable, and making sure that everything she required was within easy reach. Despite June's assurance that she was in good condition, her granddaughter eventually left, promising to call with an update in the morning. June told her granddaughter that she was all right. The granddaughter of June had assured her that she would call with one. June had experienced some discomfort in the area surrounding the cut on her leg that evening, which was to be expected. However, it did not appear to be a significant illness. June's leg had been cut. A cut had been made in June's leg. As she began to drift off to sleep, she was left with the impression that she had been extremely fortunate throughout the course of the day. However, at this point, which was probably 12 hours later, something was going on inside her body that was extremely, extremely wrong. This was the case. June was unable to determine with absolute certainty whether or not the cut that was on her thigh was connected to the new and concerning symptoms that she was experiencing. June was having these symptoms. As far as I can tell, this is the situation. As far as the paramedics are concerned, the event was not a particularly serious one. On the other hand, the severity of what she was going through, in conjunction with the sensation that her body was moving in the wrong direction, caused her to make the decision that she would absolutely not take any chances. Within the context of this particular situation, she did not pull the emergency cord that was available to her. She extended her hand to the phone that was put on the table next to her bed and dialed the number for an ambulance in order to have her transported to the hospital. She intended for the ambulance to take her to the hospital. The medical staff immediately became aware of her situation the moment she arrived at the emergency room, and they immediately began carrying out a battery of examinations as soon as they were aware of her condition. Her temperature was taken and blood was drawn from her as part of the comprehensive assessment of her vital signs that was carried out. After they had finally figured out what was going on, they were able to discover what was going on in a reasonably short amount of time. Upon completion of the examinations, it was found that she was suffering from a severe bacterial disease. The conclusion that was arrived at was found to be this. Upon further investigation, the medical professionals arrived at the conclusion that the open cut on her leg served as the point of entry for the bacteria that had invaded her body. Upon conducting their examination of her, they came to this ultimate conclusion. The fact that the sickness had already made its way into her system was an aspect of the circumstance that was much more distressing. It was because of this that she was experiencing feelings of lightheadedness and perspiration, and it also provided an explanation to the question of why her heart was racing so quickly. The emergency medical condition is known as sepsis, and it is a condition that poses a considerable risk to the individual who is being treated. The medical team was taken aback as a result of this, given the circumstances. They had a number of inquiries that would be considered to be of great significance. It is inconceivable that a cut that appeared to be very minor could have resulted in the development of such a severe sickness in such a short amount of time. The report that was submitted by the paramedics indicated that they had cleaned the wound in a proper manner prior to departing from the scene. There was not a single item that made any type of sense. On the other hand, at this particular moment in time, they were not directly concerned with locating an answer to the question of how it had occurred. All of their concentration was focused on making an effort to preserve June's life. Nobody else was paying attention to anything else. An emergency course of therapy was devised for her, which included the administration of potent antibiotics that were effective against a wide range of infections. When it comes to treating with an infection that is known to be unknown, this is the normal process that is followed. As a result of the fact that these antibiotics are of a more generic character, it is predicted that they will be successful in treating the bacteria that are responsible for the issue. June, on the other hand, was not receiving any kind of aid from it in any sense of the word. Her health did not improve, despite the fact that she exerted a great deal of effort. It was beyond reasonable doubt that the situation was deteriorating, and it was deteriorating at a rapid pace. At that point in time, June had already reached the age of 83, and her health was already in a position that was deemed to be relatively poor. Her physical being simply did not possess the reserves that were necessary to protect itself against such a tremendous onslaught. It was simply not feasible for her to have those reserves. The quick deterioration of her condition that was taking place was something that they witnessed right in front of their very eyes. All of the medical personnel were well aware that they were competing against the clock in order to complete their tasks. An ineffectiveness was identified with the antibiotics that were considered to be fundamental. In order for them to have any chance of surviving, it was vital for them to determine the specific type of bacteria that was responsible for this sickness. Only then could they have any hope of saving themselves. If they were able to identify the treatment, they might be able to use a treatment that is better targeted to the specific condition. As an illustration, they could be able to make use of an antibiotic that has been developed with the express purpose of eliminating that particular intruder. In order to isolate and identify the microscopic foe that was responsible for her death, they started doing further tests, one of which was the culture of her blood. This was done in an effort to solve the mystery of what caused her death. It was of the utmost importance that they obtain responses, and they anticipated receiving them as quickly as possible. When June's granddaughter arrived at the hospital, she was greeted by a doctor who then proceeded to have a conversation with her. June's granddaughter had rushed to the hospital as soon as she heard the news. Her granddaughter June had hurriedly made her way to the hospital. In addition to requesting that she walk him through the events that had taken place the day before, beginning with the moment she arrived at the house, he also demanded that she guide him through each step of the process. Every single thing was crucial to him, regardless of how minor or unimportant it might appear to be. He was meticulous in his attention to detail. His attention to detail was impeccable in every single respect. He inquired about the fall, the wound, and the method in which she wrapped it. He asked these questions in order to have more information. In spite of the fact that her voice was quivering with nervousness during the entirety of the story, the granddaughter continued to relate the tale. The manner in which she discovered her grandma laying on the ground, the manner in which she sought for the first aid kit, and the manner in which the paramedics arrived at the scene were all meticulously described in her narrative. While the physician was attentively listening, he nodded his head in agreement with what was being said. An inquiry was made by him. He made an inquiry. He inquired, "Was there anything else?" he asked. The granddaughter pondered for a little period of time. "Has there been anything at all that occurred in the restroom while you were searching for bandages?" From that very moment on, her thoughts were a jumbled mixture of panic and confusion. She was worried about anything that had occurred in the restroom, and she was anxious about it. Following that, however, a picture was presented to the viewer. She murmured in a quiet voice, "Her dog," saying it. "That's her dog. I brought her dog with me. He was in there with us." The doctor's approach remained the same. However, he leaned in somewhat closer to the patient who was present. "That's her dog." He made the request, "Tell me about the dog," and I said that I would comply with his request. "I brought her dog with me. What was the dog doing?" As the granddaughter reflected on the series of occurrences that had taken place, she began to experience tears welling up in her eyes. She made it clear that he was merely attempting to alleviate the suffering that she was going through at the time. A look of rising terror appeared on her face as she hesitated and said, June was on the floor, petting him. He was licking her hand and, oh God, he was licking her leg. He was licking the cut. I didn't think anything of it. I thought he was just trying to clean it, to make her feel better. The doctor thanked her and instructed her to wait to return to the laboratory. After that, he hurriedly went back to the laboratory in order to proceed with his journey before continuing on. In spite of the fact that his suspicion was a disastrous one, he was able to develop it. There was a point in time when the findings from the laboratory were brought back to the laboratory. After everything was said and done, the tests were successful in identifying the bacteria that should be eliminated. However, by the time they were able to determine the name, it was already too late for any treatment that was specifically targeted to make a difference in the circumstance where they found themselves. Her immune system was completely weakened by the virus, and it took complete control of her body. As June was suffering from acute sepsis, a condition that offers a significant threat to her chances of survival, she was in a terrible danger of not surviving. When the body's response to an infection becomes so intense that it begins to cause harm to the body's own tissues and important organs, the signs of this condition become apparent. This disorder is characterized by a dysfunction in the immune system. Because her body was making a frantic effort to defend itself against the invasion, her body was, in effect, shutting himself down. This was because her body was trying to combat the invasion. The members of the medical staff were successful in doing everything that they were able to successfully complete. Despite their efforts to treat her with a variety of treatments and even put her on life support, the illness continued to progress without any interruptions. However, these precautions were not adequate to prevent the virus from spreading further. As a result of the illness that she had been afflicted with, June Baxter passed dead just 1 week after she was sent to the hospital for treatment. In the end, it would be revealed that the potentially harmful bacteria that had made its way into June's open wound had been administered to her in the most heinous and unexpected manner that could possibly be dreamt of. The situation would be like this. Additionally, the bacterium was referred to as Pasteurella multocida for the purpose of providing additional information. However, the bacterium in question is not the kind that is generally discovered on the floor of a lavatory or in the nook of a countertop. This is because the bacterium in question is not a mold. It is specifically located in the interior of the lips of domestic cats and dogs. Examples of these animals include cats and dogs. The location in question is really specific. During the time that June was waiting for her granddaughter to locate bandages, her cherished and elderly dog was behaving in the same manner that it had always done. This took place at the same time that June was making herself comfortable on the floor of the restroom. The purpose of this was to comfort her that there was nothing wrong with her. It was able to convey its feelings of compassion and concern for the people who were in its close area by utilizing the only means that were accessible to it. In addition, the dog had begun licking the wound that was exposed in front of her as a means of providing her with some degree of comfort for the time being. Irrespective of the fact that it was a gesture of affection toward a member of its pack who had been harmed, it was also an inclination to care for the individual in question. However, as a result of this action, the dog had unwittingly delivered the germs that caused Pasteurella multicida into June's bloodstream. This illness was caused by the bacteria that caused the disease. The dog's saliva included these microorganisms which were discovered. The wound had been cleaned by the paramedics when they arrived. Nevertheless, by the time they had finished, the germs had already started to spread throughout the body. It became impossible to maintain control over the situation, and it started to grow at a breakneck speed. In spite of the fact that the individual had been younger and in better health, it is still feasible that the immune system would have been able to prevent the illness from happening. On the other hand, there was a sentence of death for a woman who was 83 years old and experienced significant health issues prior to the sentence being handed down. Her execution was carried out. The aftermath of the catastrophe was unfortunately a very unpleasant one due to the circumstances. To put it another way, there was no offense that required legal action to be taken, and there was no one who was to blame for the situation. An extremely peculiar accident occurred as a result of a fleeting time of feelings of devotion. The accident was caused by a brief moment of devotion. In light of the events that transpired, June's granddaughter was left with a significant amount of humiliation that she had to carry with her. She had to come to grips with the fact that she had unknowingly set in motion the series of events that ultimately led to her grandmother's dying by bringing the dog that she thought would provide her grandmother with peace. She had brought the puppy to her grandmother in the mistaken belief that it would provide her with comfort. She was forced to confront the reality that she was the one who was responsible for the passing of her grandma. The dog that June had loved so much, the one that served as a live link to her late husband and happier times, was the unknowing instrument that had led to her passing away earlier than she had intended. June had loved the puppy so much that it served as a living link to her husband and happier times. The dog had been of great affection to June. The painful irony that exists is one that, when everything is taken into consideration, is nearly impossible to fathom. It was a simple fall, a small cut, and an act of love from a devoted pet that all came together in the most terrible way possible, resulting in the death of a woman who had only wanted to spend her final years in the quiet and freedom of her own home. The woman's death was the result of all of these little things coming together. Friends and family of the deceased woman suffered a terrible loss when she passed away. To begin, I would like to convey my appreciation for your presence in this room today. In the event that you watch the program that was broadcast tonight, I would be grateful if you could please share your thoughts with me in the comment section. It is also important to keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of True Crime available for you to view all at once right now. Within a single sitting, you are able to watch all of these episodes, at least until the next time we get together. How are things going? Bill Vale has always been an incredibly scientifically minded person. He's the kind of guy who trusts data, logic, and proven facts. He's had technical jobs his entire life, jobs that required precision and a clear analytical mind. For 15 years, he worked for NASA as a robotics engineer. He even spent some time as a pilot for NASA. If you ask his family and friends, they'll tell you with respect that Bill sort of lacks an imagination. He's not a creative person. He's pragmatic, he's to the point, and he's all about facts. He doesn't have time for anything that can't be explained or proven. In 2002, Bill's life took an unexpected turn. He and his wife separated, and the change caught him completely off guard. It threw him into something of a midlife crisis. For years, his work at NASA had been the most fulfilling part of his life, but now, with his family life crumbling, a huge void opened up. He started questioning everything. He looked around and thought, what am I even doing all this for? I don't have a family anymore. So, he made a big decision. He decided to move back to his hometown of Arlington, Texas, where his younger brother lived. He needed a fresh start, a way to reset his life. Once he got to Arlington, things started to feel a little bit better. Having family around made him feel less lonely. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his career long term, so he took a job at his brother's water purification company. It was a way to keep busy, to do something productive while he figured out his next steps. It was a big change from being a robotics engineer at NASA, but he found that working day in and day out with his brother was comforting. It was exactly what he needed at that moment in his life. He was just settling in, trying to build a new routine for himself. Bill had only been living in Arlington for a couple of months and had been at the water purification company for just a few weeks. One Saturday, a house call came into the company. It was late in the day and nobody really wanted to take it. Bill saw it as an opportunity. He figured he'd take one for the team, make a good impression on his new coworkers. So he volunteered for the job. Part of his role was to go to customers' homes and demonstrate how to install and use their new water purification system. It was a straightforward task, something he could do easily. But this particular house call started off a little strange. The dispatcher at the company pulled him aside. She told him, "Hey, listen, this is a bit weird, but the person who called was very specific. They were adamant that you have to be there at exactly 5 o'clock. Not a minute earlier, not a minute later. It was only about 3 in the afternoon at that point." Bill asked her what he was supposed to do for the next 2 hours. She just shrugged and said, "I don't know. Go grab a bite to eat or something. Just make sure you are there right at 5. So that's what he did. He thought it was an odd request, but a customer is a customer. He drove around for a while, killed some time, and then parked his car down the street from the address. He watched the clock. A couple of minutes before 5, he got out of his car and started walking over to the property. It was a big brick house. As he walked up the path, right around 4:59 p.m., he started to hear something. He could hear screaming coming from inside the house. As he got closer to the front door, he could tell it was slightly ajar, not fully latched. The sound was a woman's voice, and it sounded like she was screaming, "Get out of here!" Bill didn't really know what to make of it. He had a job to do. So he walked up to the steps, and even though the door was already open, he knocked. Now, standing right there, he could clearly hear through the crack in the door that someone inside was screaming over and over again. He hesitated for a moment. He listened. Finally, he decided he should probably just open the door and make sure everything was okay. The screaming was alarming, and the door was open. It seemed like the right thing to do. He pushed the door open and took one step inside. He peered around a corner and could see a little way down the hall. Off to the right, there was an opening to a room. And in that room, he saw an unbelievable scene. There were 3 men on their knees, arranged in a small circle. A woman was walking around them, also in a circle. She was holding a book in her hand, and she was speaking in tongues. It was just nonsensical language, nothing he could understand. But every so often, as she circled the men and touched each of their heads, she would scream, "Get out of here! Leave these people! Get out of here!" Bill was about to turn around and leave. This was way too weird for him. He wanted no part of whatever this was. But just before he could back out the door, the woman who was circling the men looked up. She looked directly at him. She pointed a finger straight at him and didn't break eye contact. She just held her finger out, aimed right at his chest. And in that moment, Bill felt this very strange, very strong sense that this woman wanted to harm him. It was a purely instinctual feeling, but it was overwhelming. He didn't wait for a second thought. He just turned and ran out the door. He got back to his car and immediately called the dispatcher. He told her, "Okay, I just went on the most insane house call of my life. The lady in there is crazy. I am not doing it. Don't you dare reschedule it, and if you do, do not put me on it, because I will not go back in there. Bill, being the straightforward guy he was, tried not to let his imagination get the better of him. He told himself those people were just crazy, and it wasn't his business. It wasn't his problem. So, he tried to forget about it. He drove home, turned on the TV, got a microwave dinner out of the freezer, and just sat there eating his food, trying to have a nice, quiet Saturday night to himself. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something in his other room. Now, you have to remember, Bill lived completely alone. He had no pets, but he was sure he saw something small dart across the ground. He couldn't quite tell if it was flying or running, but he saw movement. He just thought, oh, great. Now I've got some kind of rodent or maybe a bird in my house. It must have snuck in through the chimney or something. Bill wasn't scared. He was mostly just frustrated. Now he had to deal with getting some animal out of his house. He put his food down, turned on all the lights, because he'd been watching TV in the dark, and started to search. He moved quietly, listening for any sign of it, any scurrying sounds, trying to figure out where the thing went. But he couldn't hear a thing. After searching for over an hour, he just gave up. He thought maybe I didn't even see it in the first place. Maybe my eyes were just playing tricks on me. Later that night, he was asleep in his bed when he suddenly woke up. He felt what seemed like a small creature running over the foot of his bed right across his feet. It was so distinct that it woke him up instantly. His first instinct was to pull his legs up to his chest, tucking them under the covers, just like anyone would do if some random animal ran across them in the middle of the night. He thought, great. This thing, whatever it is, it's probably a rat. And now it's in my bedroom, on my bed. He was more angry than anything else. This was the last thing he needed in the middle of the night. He flipped on the lights, ready to find this thing and get it out of his room. He searched everywhere. He looked under his dresser. He looked in the closet. He got down on his hands and knees and looked under the bed. He stopped every few moments to listen, but he couldn't hear any scurrying, nothing at all. He started to question himself again. Did I imagine that too? I mean, I thought I saw something dart across the room earlier when I was watching TV. And just now, could that have just been part of a dream? He wasn't fully awake when it happened. He woke up to the sensation. So he started to convince himself that he was somehow creating this weird thought in his head. He probably didn't see anything downstairs, and he was probably just having a dream about a rodent in his house, and that's what made him think something had touched his feet. So he just told himself, all right, whatever, turned off the lights, and went back to bed. Bill managed to fall back asleep, but it wasn't for long. A short time later, he woke up again when his entire bed started shaking violently. He shot up, wide awake, and as soon as he was conscious, the shaking stopped. His first thought was that there was an earthquake. He jumped out of bed, looking around to see if things were going to start falling off the shelves. He ran to the window and looked outside, but he couldn't tell what was going on. He ran into the other room, and in his slight panic, he could tell that the shaking was completely gone. The house was totally silent. He went back to his bed and had a strange thought. Could I have somehow shaken the bed myself in my sleep? He had one of those huge, heavy four-poster beds. He was a big, strong guy, and he tried to move it himself, but he could barely make it budge. He had this distinct memory of the bed literally shaking back and forth. Now, this was the third strange thing that had happened, and he couldn't make sense of any of it. Being the pragmatic person he was, with no wild imagination to speak of, he decided to find a logical explanation. He thought, okay, let's find out if there was an earthquake. He went to his computer and started searching online for recent earthquake reports. He figured if it had just happened, the news would be breaking right then and there, some headline would pop up. But there was nothing. Not a single report. So he moved on to other possibilities. Okay, he thought, what other rational things could have caused my house to shake? He remembered that there was a military airbase a couple of miles from his house. He considered that maybe a fighter jet was taking off, and the sonic boom from it accelerating could have caused the vibration. He wasn't sure if that was it, but it seemed possible. Then he thought about all the oil rigs drilling in the area. Maybe there had been some kind of accident at one of them. He started researching recent accidents at local oil rigs. He was just desperately trying to find a rational scientific explanation for why his bed was shaking. He also couldn't stop thinking about the thing he thought he saw, the thing that touched his feet. He wasn't connecting the two events directly, but he had this unsettling feeling that either something was seriously wrong with him and he was losing his mind, or something really weird was happening on his property. As he was in the middle of this research, trying to find a logical answer, his internet connection went out. He tried troubleshooting it a few times, but he couldn't get it to work. So he had to call his service provider to see if they could fix it from their end. He got through to customer service, and someone picked up. They confirmed, "Yep, it looks like your internet is out. Let me fix that for you. I'm just going to put you on a brief hold." So they put him on hold. He was sitting there, listening to that typical staticky elevator music when the sound started to change. A strange, staticky noise came through the receiver. It was nothing significant at first, but then a voice started speaking. It was speaking in tongues, just like the woman at the house call. It was nonsensical language, and it sounded almost threatening. Bill was totally unsettled by this voice. It just went on and on. He'd been on hold for about 2 minutes now, just listening to this bizarre voice. He finally just hung up the phone. Just a few seconds later, his phone rang. It was the same customer service representative he had just been speaking to. The rep had a distinct accent, so Bill knew it was him. Bill asked, "Hey, was I just talking to you?" The customer service rep sounded a little flustered. He said, "Yeah, sorry about that, we got disconnected." Bill then asked, "Did you hear that voice? Did you hear that strange voice on the phone?" The customer service rep, who usually stuck to a script, seemed to deviate for a moment. He said, "Actually, yes, I did hear that." He went on to explain that he was trying to figure out how it was even possible because they used a very secure phone line to talk to customers. He said there was really no way for someone to block his ability to speak to Bill. Even if someone had somehow gotten on the call, Bill should have still been able to hear him. The rep said, "I was trying to yell to you, but you weren't hearing me." "I definitely heard the voice. I don't know what that was, and we're very sorry." So both of them were clearly weirded out by it. But the customer service rep had a job to do. He told Bill, "Hey, your internet is working again. Thanks for calling." He hung up, and Bill was left with his internet working, but now he had a fourth strange event to deal with. The thing that ran across the room. The thing that ran across his feet. The shaking bed. And now this devil-like voice speaking in tongues on the phone, which crucially the customer service rep had also heard. He decided he was done doing research for the night. It was something like 3 a.m. He just wanted to try and get a couple of hours of sleep. This was all starting to freak him out. So Bill got back into his bed. He was trying to sleep, but he couldn't stop thinking about the 4 strange things that had happened in just a few hours. He couldn't help but start to feel a little bit worried. He felt like something he didn't understand was going on, and it felt bad. As he was lying there, desperately trying to fall asleep, he swore he could hear some kind of sound coming from underneath his bed. He knew it could be his mind playing tricks on him, but it didn't matter. He thought he heard it, and at that point, he was officially spooked. Like a little kid, he pulled the covers up over his head. He was just lying on his bed with the covers pulled tight, basically trying to convince himself that this wasn't happening. "There's nothing under your bed, just relax." He had his legs pulled up near his chest, completely under the sheets. The way he was positioned was important. He had left a light on in his room, and the light was beaming down onto the sheet that was covering the upper part of his body. This created a little bit of light inside the cavern under his sheets. So, as he was holding the covers up over his head, trying to tell himself that nothing was going on, he looked down towards the foot of his bed under the covers, and he saw a hand. It was slowly reaching up from the side of the bed. It came up, and it sort of grabbed for his foot. It just missed, and then it retracted back out from under the bed. Bill literally leaped out of his bed. He flipped on every single light in the room and was now in absolute crisis mode. He immediately backed himself up against the wall. He didn't even want to look under the bed, but eventually he forced himself to. He kind of poked his head down and looked. There was nothing there. He searched his entire room again. There was no sign that anybody had been in there. And now he was at a loss. He had experienced so many strange occurrences, and none of them made any sense. He had no idea what to do next. Bill did not even attempt to go back to bed that night. He went downstairs, turned on every light in the entire house, and started drinking coffee. He was determined to stay awake. The next day, he just tried to have a normal day. He didn't want to think about what had happened the night before. He went to work like usual and didn't tell anyone about it. Again, Bill was a straight shooter. He wasn't about to be the former NASA robotics engineer who starts telling people about paranormal stuff happening in his house. He was doing everything he could to not think like that. By the end of the day, though, as he was getting ready to go home, he started to feel a bit of anxiety. He knew he would have to potentially face more of the strange things that happened the night before. He got home and immediately turned on all his lights. He was not about to sit in the dark. He was sitting in the same chair he always sat in, the one where he first saw that thing dart across the room. He was eating his microwave dinner and watching TV again with all the lights in his house blazing. He looked down for just a second to take another bite of his food. And when he looked back up, a bottle was flying through the air straight towards his head. He instinctively moved his head out of the way, and the bottle hit the wall right beside him. It was a glass bottle, and it shattered all over the ground. And at that exact moment, all the lights in the house went out. Bill ran to the closet where he knew he kept a flashlight. He opened the door, reached in for the flashlight, and as he was about to pull it out, he heard a loud slamming sound coming from the top of the closet. He had a couple of heavy boxes stored on the very top shelf. The sound was as if someone had lifted one of those boxes up and slammed it back down on the shelf. But obviously, he hadn't done it. It totally freaked him out. He grabbed the flashlight, shined it all around the closet. There was no one in there. There was nothing out of place. He backed out of the closet, and just then, the lights came back on. His heart was racing because he knew what had just happened. Someone, or something, had just thrown a bottle at his head. Something had just slammed a heavy box in his closet. He was in full panic mode. The only person he could think to call was his brother. He wasn't ready to go to the police. What would he even say? The things he would need to describe sounded completely nonsensical. But his brother Bob was also very rational, equally pragmatic in his approach to things. He called his brother and just said, "Get over here. I've got some weird stuff happening in my house, and I just need a sanity check." So his younger brother Bob came over. As soon as Bob got there, Bill didn't know how to start. He had never had a conversation about the paranormal with his brother before. So he just said, "All right, this is going to sound weird, Bob, but I need you to just go in this closet. Just go in the closet." Bob looked at him like he was crazy and asked what he was talking about. Bill just said, "Please just go in there. I'm going to shut the door, and I want you to just tell me what happens." Bob, seeing how distressed his brother was, agreed. "All right," he said, and he went into the closet. Bill shut the door behind him and just waited outside. After a moment, Bill called out to him, "Hey, turn off the light in there. There's a little pull string for a tiny light bulb." Bob turned off the light, and it was pitch black inside. Now, at the time, Bob would not tell Bill what happened to him in that closet. Mostly because if you put yourself in Bob's shoes, He had no context for any of this. He had never experienced anything like it before. So, when things happened to him in there, he chalked it up to his own clumsiness. He was standing in the dark closet when he felt something hit his leg. He just thought, oh, I must have knocked into a pair of shoes or something. He just stood there, and then something hit him hard in the face. He thought, I must have hit something on the top shelf, and it fell and hit me in the head. But the two things happening back to back did unsettle him a little bit. He made a conscious decision not to tell Bill what had happened. He thought it would only feed into his brother's paranoia, and that wasn't what he needed right now. He opened the closet door, stepped out, and said, you know what, Bill? Nothing happened in there. You've got nothing to worry about. There's nothing in here. He left, and Bill was left feeling kind of crestfallen. He felt like he hadn't done a good job of conveying to his brother just how serious the situation was. He felt out of his element and didn't know how to handle it. He had only one other person he felt comfortable talking to about this, mostly because the whole situation was just embarrassing for him. He was this esteemed former NASA employee. The last thing he wanted was for people to think he was losing his mind. But he had a friend named Michael who was a sound engineer for a couple of podcasts. When he called him, Bill didn't even really know what he was going to say. He just needed to talk to a friendly voice. Michael was a little surprised to get a call from Bill. They made some small talk, and then Bill just said, you know, I don't know how to approach this with you, but I just moved to Arlington, and I've got some weird stuff going on in my house. I guess I'm just telling you because I don't know what else to do. Michael was a bit caught off guard, and was mostly just worried about his friend. He started asking some basic questions, like what Bill had heard or seen, not really sure if it was worth exploring, but just trying to be a good friend. As they were having this conversation, the same voice that had come on the phone during the call to the internet company came on the line again. All of a sudden, Bill couldn't hear Michael, and Michael couldn't hear Bill. All they could both hear was this angry, demonic-sounding voice that was very threatening. Michael, being a sound engineer, instinctively thought to record it. He had all his equipment right there. He grabbed a microphone, put it up to the receiver, and started recording. He sat there for a minute and a half recording this voice. About 30 seconds into the recording, Bill, on the other end, who had heard this voice before and was starting to get the feeling that this whole thing was really bad, started yelling into the phone. He was yelling for Michael to hang up. Don't listen to this. Hang up. Hang up the phone. Don't listen to the voice! After about a minute and a half of this chaos, the voice suddenly stopped. The line went back to normal, and Bill and Michael could hear each other again, crystal clear. Michael immediately said, "Hey, Bill, are you there?" Bill said, "Yeah, I'm here." "I was trying to get you to get off the phone. You can't listen to this stuff. I don't know what it is, but it's bad." And Michael just said, "No, listen. I recorded that. Here, let me play it back for you." He started playing the recording back, and all it was silence, except for the parts where Bill was yelling, "Don't listen to it! Hang up!" And Michael was yelling at the beginning, "Hey, what is that? What is this?" The recording had only picked up their own voices. The demonic, possessed-sounding voice was completely gone from the audio. At this point, Bill was starting to get genuinely scared. He wouldn't admit it, but he was alone in this house with all this strange stuff happening. He decided to invite his brother over for dinner again. He thought having other people in the house might help. So Bob and his wife Cindy came over. Bill was sitting in his usual chair, and Bob and Cindy were on the couch. They were having a nice time, just watching TV. Bill remembered feeling how nice it was just to have other people there. As they were watching, Bill suddenly stood up and ran over to the room where he had originally seen that thing dart by. Bob and Cindy saw him jump up and run over, and they asked, "Hey, what did you see?" "What was that?" Bill tried to explain. He said, "I don't know how to describe what I saw, but I saw this thing that's in my house." "Bob, this is why I brought you over here. I've been seeing this animal or something running around, and I swear I just saw it again." He pointed to his chair. "Hey, look, Bob, sit in my chair. It was the only place in the room with a clear vantage point into that other room. From the couch where Bob and Cindy were sitting, you couldn't really see into it. Bill said, "Just listen to me. Sit in my seat and just watch the TV. Don't pay attention to the room, just watch TV and see if something catches your eye. Maybe I'm seeing something totally rational, but something is happening. Just do what I was doing." Bob was skeptical, but agreed. "All right," he said, and he sat in the chair. Bill sat down next to Cindy on the couch, and they all started watching TV again. After just a few minutes, Bob suddenly reacted, clearly seeing something in the other room. He jumped up and said, "Oh my God, what is that?" They all stood up, and Bill asked him, "Well, what did you see?" Bob was shaken. He said, "I don't know. It was like some kind of small animal or something, but it looked like it was on 2 feet. It didn't look like a 4-legged animal. That was a 2-legged animal." What was that? Now Bob was starting to believe. He was thinking about what happened to him in the closet, the things he didn't tell Bill about. Now this. He turned to his wife and said, "Okay, Cindy, you sit in the seat. You do this now." So Cindy sat in the chair, and Bill and Bob sat on the couch watching her. Sure enough, in just a matter of minutes, she saw it too. She saw something dart across the other room. Now, was she just jumping on the bandwagon because the other two saw it? Maybe. But she described the exact same thing they did, a small bipedal creature running through the dining room. The three of them turned on all the lights and started searching the entire house. They were determined to find this thing. They searched everywhere for hours, but they couldn't find a single trace of it. Finally, it was getting late, and Bob and Cindy knew they had to leave. They said, "Hey, Bill, I don't know what's happening in your house, but why don't you just come stay with us tonight? We have a guest room. Just crash with us, and you can come back in the morning and call animal control or whatever you want to do. You shouldn't be here alone tonight." In a way, Bill was actually happy. He finally had someone he trusted, his own family, who had confirmed that they were seeing the same things he was. It was terrifying to think there was some creature in his house, but at least he knew he wasn't losing his mind. Or if he was, at least other people were too. He was relieved. But he told them, "You know what? I'm not going to go with you. I don't want to just give up my house. What will I do when I come back if it just keeps happening? I don't want to just give up." So Bob and Cindy left, and Bill was alone again. But now he was determined. For the first time, he started looking up paranormal explanations for what was happening. He quickly realized that just searching for the paranormal online was useless. There were too many things, and it was impossible to tell what was credible and what wasn't. There was no fact-checking, just people posting stories. So he decided to change his approach. Instead of doing the research himself, he would find a paranormal investigative team, but he wanted a specific kind of team. He wanted one that approached their investigations like a scientist would, looking for an answer, even if that answer was totally normal, instead of just looking for proof that ghosts exist. He started searching for investigative paranormal teams with a scientific focus in his area of Texas. And he actually found one. He reached out to them, and they were available to come over that very night. He told them, "Please, come over. I need your help." The leader of the paranormal team was a man named Brian Hall. When they arrived, it was Brian and a couple of his crew members. They didn't start by diving into a paranormal investigation. They started by looking for obvious, rational answers. They had found that many times what people think is a paranormal event is actually something simple, like a bad air conditioning unit, a creaky door, or a tree branch rubbing against the house. They did a very long and thorough examination of the entire house, inside and out, looking for things like that. They determined that there was nothing obvious that could provide a rational explanation. So now it was time to set up their equipment. They set up a couple of cameras in Bill's bedroom, since that's where a lot of the activity seemed to be happening. They also set up these special laser beams that projected a grid of lasers in every direction. They placed them in his bedroom so that there were laser beams crisscrossing the entire room. The idea was that if anything, no matter how small, walked past any of these lasers, you would see the beams move, and it would be very obvious. It was a way to detect motion in the room. They set up the beams, started the cameras, and they waited. For a long time, absolutely nothing happened. Bill, Brian Hall, and the rest of the team were just sitting in the dining room downstairs, listening to silence and watching the monitors, seeing nothing. So Brian suggested something. He said, "Hey, why don't one of my team members go up there and just interact with the room a little bit? Go in there, yell a bit, do something to kind of stir it up, so to speak, and we'll see if anything happens." One of the team members went up to the room and walked in. He said, "Hey, is anybody in here?" Nothing happened. On the footage, you can see him jump onto the bed and sit there. At one point, as he's yelling out to whatever might be in the room, "Hey, if you're in here, show yourself," all of a sudden, on camera, you hear one of the laser projectors fall to the ground. He jumps out of bed and runs out of the room. The rest of the team came running up. They gathered up the cameras and immediately went to watch the footage. As they were watching, they saw something that the team member in the room hadn't seen at all. They saw a mist begin to form in the room. The mist started swirling in front of the laser beams right on camera just before you hear the sound of the laser projector falling to the ground off camera. At first, they were just dumbfounded. They were wondering how the mist got in there, what it was. They considered if maybe the laser beam had just rolled off a table, if it had been positioned in a way that it could have fallen on its own. They raised the sound levels on the video, and they were able to make out a couple of words being spoken, though it was faint. At this point, Brian Hall and his team felt like they had a good amount of data that did lend credibility to the idea that there was something paranormal happening in Bill's house. As they were packing up their equipment to leave, they said to Bill, "You've got to go. You can't stay here." "I'm surprised you're still here now." But Bill was just this incredibly prideful guy. He told them, "No, I'm going to stay. I've made the decision. I'm not going to run. I'm going to stay here in this house." They told him it was a bad idea. And honestly, they were right, because some pretty horrible stuff happened after they left. That night, Bill knew he wasn't going to sleep. He had all the lights on in his bedroom. He was sitting on his bed with his knees tucked up to his chin. He had upbeat classical music playing on a radio right next to his bed, just trying to create some kind of good vibes in the room. As he was sitting there, he heard a sound like a Mack truck smashing into the side of his house. It was so loud, so deafening, that he instantly sprinted out of his door, ran downstairs, and ran outside to inspect the damage to his property. But there was nothing outside. There was no Mack truck. There was no damage to his house. Nothing. He walked all around his property looking for any explanation. Did something fall on the street? Am I losing my mind? What is going on? After looking around for a while and finding nothing, he went back inside. As soon as he stepped foot back in his house, he heard a similarly loud crashing sound as if a vehicle was smashing into his house, but this time it was inside, in his dining room. It was the same room where he first saw that creature running across the ground. He ran in there expecting to find horrible damage, but there was nothing disturbed. Nothing was shaking, nothing was out of place. His dining room was completely intact. As he was standing there trying to process this, he heard his car alarm go off outside, and now he started to think, this thing is just messing with me. I'm not going to let it win. I've stayed here against better judgment for days. I'm not going to give in now. So Bill kind of went into fight mode. He was mad now. Instead of being scared of what was happening, he started screaming at the top of his lungs, "Show yourself!" As he was doing that, he heard yet another loud crashing sound, this time from up in his bedroom. He ran upstairs, ready to fight with whatever this was. He had reached a breaking point. He charged into his room, but there was nothing in there. But unlike the dining room and outside, the crashing sound continued while he was in the bedroom. He was standing there, holding his ears because of the deafening crashing sounds happening over and over and over again, but there was nothing moving in the room. There was no way for that sound to be coming from that room, but it was. After what felt like an eternity of this horrible smashing sound, it just completely stopped. It was dead silent. Bill slowly lifted his hands off his ears. He looked around, expecting the noise to start again, but it didn't. There was just dead silence throughout the entire house. After a long while, when he still didn't hear anything, he got back in his bed. All the lights were still on, his radio was still playing. He tucked his legs up to his chin and was just holding himself, basically in the fetal position. At this point, he was petrified. He'd had his big moment of fighting back, but now he was thinking that this thing was just challenging him in return. It was basically saying, I can do whatever I want to you and you can't touch me. He was realizing that he might have just made things worse. He was sitting there, knowing he wasn't going to sleep. It was still the middle of the night, and he started to hear a noise. It sounded like shuffling feet. Something was moving around underneath his bed. As he was sitting on his bed, at the head of the bed near his pillow, with his feet tucked in, he looked towards the foot of his bed, and this huge, wide, 6-foot-tall black figure emerged. It was in a brightly lit room, but this figure was pure black. It emerged at the foot of his bed. It had this huge tooth coming out of its mouth. It got into this jerky, unnatural position and started moving towards Bill. It got right in front of him. It put its face right up against Bill's face, then it let out a grunt, and then it just disappeared. Bill continued to see this horrible black figure in his house. It continued to challenge him, but Bill stopped challenging it back. He started waking up with scratches on his chest. He was even hospitalized a couple of times, which prompted the hospital to do welfare checks on him. He was showing up with what doctors thought were mini heart attacks brought on by the extreme stress he claimed was from having this stuff happen to him. His family was incredibly concerned. It wasn't until Bill started doing some really aggressive research on demons that he read about exorcism. And he remembered. He remembered that when he showed up for that house call, a lot of the language he was hearing from that screaming woman, leave these people, leave this house, it sounded like an exorcism. He started to wonder, is it possible that the woman performing the exorcism knew that she needed to find another host for these demons? Did she plan it so that this water purification person would show up at exactly 5 p.m. so that she could be at the right point in her ritual to cast the demons onto him? He had 2 exorcisms performed on his own house, but it still hasn't stopped. To this day, he is still dealing with the paranormal activity in his home. When he's asked why he has never sold the house, he says that he couldn't live with himself if he ever put another person through what he has dealt with in that house. He feels a responsibility to contain it. He has lived in that house for over 18 years since these events began, enduring it all rather than passing the horror on to someone else. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Think about the physical spaces you occupy throughout your everyday life. We move through our world with a deep sense of comfort and routine, never expecting that the ground we walk on, the homes we live in, or the natural places we visit could suddenly turn against us. We trust our surroundings. We believe that if we are familiar with a path, a room, or a landscape, we are safe. But the reality is that danger can hide in the most mundane places, waiting for a single misstep or a brief moment of distraction. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible and tragic stories of people who stepped into places they were never supposed to be, leading to unexpected and devastating outcomes. Our first story takes us to a small, quiet village in central India, surrounded by dusty fields and narrow dirt roads. It was late on the night of Friday, the 18th of September 2015. A 45-year-old man named Later Barman was walking down a road. He was not walking in a straight line. In fact, he was stumbling. Later was extremely drunk. Earlier that evening, Later and his wife had gone to a local festival, a fair in their area. They had spent hours walking around, enjoying the music, the colorful stalls, the food, and especially the drinks. They had a lot to drink. Later was known in the village as a friendly, hard-working man, but he was also someone who loved to drink, and sometimes he did not know when to stop. As the night went on, his wife started to feel tired. She decided she wanted to go visit her parents who lived in a neighboring village. She suggested they head out together, but Later was not ready to go home. He was in a great mood, and he wanted to keep the fun rolling. So, his wife decided to leave for her parents' house, thinking Later would head home shortly after. Later, however, stayed behind. He walked over to a local liquor store and bought even more alcohol. He sat there and drank until he was heavily intoxicated. By the time he finally decided to walk home, it was late at night, and he could barely keep his balance. He began the long, slow stumble back to his house. But the problem was, this village did not have streetlights. When the sun went down, the streets became completely black. Later could only see maybe a foot or two in front of him. But Later had lived in this village for his entire life. He had walked this exact road hundreds of times in the dark, so he felt confident he could find his way back. He staggered along, guided mostly by muscle memory and the faint silhouette of trees against the night sky. He was focusing hard on his balance, his head spinning from all the alcohol he had consumed. He did not even notice how cold the night air was becoming. As he walked, he started to notice some unusual things. He could hear people talking in the distance. He heard the deep rumbling of engines and saw faint lights flickering through the darkness. It seemed like there was a lot of activity on the road, which was strange for that time of night. But because he was so drunk, Later did not think to stop and investigate. He assumed it was just people hanging out or some cars driving by. He kept pushing forward, trying to keep his footing on the uneven dirt road. And then, suddenly, everything changed. Later took a step forward, expecting his foot to hit the solid ground. But there was nothing there. He stepped directly into empty air. Before he could react, he fell face first into a deep, dark hole. The impact was violent. He hit the bottom hard, his head smashing against the ground, and he was instantly knocked unconscious. Later lay there, silent and hidden in the shadows of the deep pit. Fast forward to the next morning. It was a bright, sunny Saturday. A group of local villagers were walking down the very same road that Later had taken the night before. As they walked, they were enjoying the morning air when they noticed something strange sitting right in the middle of the road. From a distance, they could not make out what it was. It looked like a dark, irregular shape protruding from the ground. They walked closer to investigate, and as they got within a few feet, they realized what they were looking at. They screamed in terror and ran to find the police. What they saw was a human hand sticking straight up out of the asphalt. It turns out the road Later was walking on was notorious for having massive, dangerous potholes. For months, the villagers had complained about them. Finally, the local government had sent a construction crew to repair the road. Because it was a main road, the crew decided to work late at night when there was very little traffic. This was the noise and the lights that Later had heard and seen while he was walking home. As Later stumbled along in his drunken state, he had walked right into one of these deep, open potholes that the crew had prepared for filling. When he fell, he was knocked cold at the bottom of the pit. Because the construction site was dark, chaotic, and filled with heavy machinery, none of the workers noticed that a man had fallen into the hole. A short time later, the crew reached that exact pothole. They did not look inside. Instead, they poured a massive load of boiling molten tar directly into the hole, completely burying Later underneath it. Then they drove a heavy road roller over the spot to flatten it out and seal the road. Investigators believe that at some point, the heat of the tar or the pressure of the roller may have briefly woken Later up. In his final, agonizing moments, he tried to claw his way out of the suffocating hot liquid. He managed to push his hand up through the tar, reaching toward the sky, but he could not pull the rest of his body out. He died, trapped beneath the fresh asphalt. Following the discovery, Lader's body was carefully removed from the road, and he was given a proper burial by his family. The police launched an investigation into the construction company, and 2 of the workers who were on duty that night were arrested and charged with culpable homicide. The local authorities offered Lader's grieving family a compensation payment, but it was only worth about $760. It was a tragic, senseless end to a man who was just trying to walk home on a dark night. Now, let us move to our second story, which takes us to the rural town of Huron, California. This is an extremely rural and isolated area where houses are spread far apart, surrounded by open fields and dusty roads. The date is the 28th of November, 2015. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, a man pulled his car into his driveway. He had been away from his house overnight, and he was eager to get inside and relax. But as soon as he stepped out of his car, his anxiety began to rise. The neighborhood he lived in was not safe. In fact, over the course of the previous year, his home had been broken into multiple times. Each time, the thieves had stolen some of his belongings, leaving him feeling violated and unsafe in his own home. But the problem was, this man could not call the police. He was wanted by the authorities on an active warrant for felony drug possession. If he called the police to report a break-in, they would run his name, find the warrant, and arrest him on the spot. So, he had to take his security into his own hands. He had developed a strict routine that he followed every single time he came home. He walked up to his porch and grabbed the doorknob, checking to see if it was still locked. It was, which gave him a small sigh of relief. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. But he did not just walk into his living room. Instead, he stood perfectly still in the entryway. He held his breath and listened. He was listening for any creak of a floorboard, any sound of breathing, or any sign that someone was hiding in his house. The house was completely silent. He walked in, flipped on the lights, and put his keys and wallet down on the table. But he still was not satisfied. He began a systematic, room-by-room sweep of his entire home. He checked the windows to make sure none of them were broken. He went to the kitchen and checked the back door, confirming it was still locked. He looked around his dining room. Everything seemed to be in order. He did notice that some mail sitting on a table looked a bit messy, as if someone might have flipped through it. But then he remembered that he had been in a rush the night before, and he might have just left it like that himself. He decided he was being overly paranoid. He took a deep breath, walked into the living room, sat down on his couch, and turned on the television. For a few minutes, he started to relax. He felt glad that his house was secure and that nothing had been disturbed. But as he sat there, he realized the house was very cold. He started to shiver. He got up from the couch, walked over to his thermostat, and turned on his heating system. Then he sat back down, waiting for the house to warm up. Only a minute later, a terrifying, high-pitched scream ripped through the silence of the house. The homeowner was absolutely terrified. He had no idea where the sound was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls or perhaps from the fireplace. He ran over to investigate, and the screams grew louder and more desperate. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, and it made his stomach turn. It turns out the man's fears about his home being targeted were entirely correct. The night before, while he was away, a 19-year-old man named Cody Caldwell had decided to burglarize the house. But instead of trying to force open a window or a door, Cody had climbed onto the roof. He had spotted the chimney and decided he could slide down it to gain access to the house. Cody thought this was a brilliant plan, but he had made a fatal mistake. Chimneys are not wide, straight chutes. They often narrow significantly near the bottom. As Cody slid down, he got completely wedged about halfway down the chimney. He could not move up, and he could not move down. His arms were pinned tightly to his sides, and the rough brick walls scraped against his skin. Every time he tried to wriggle free, he only slid deeper and tighter into the narrow brick passage. He was trapped in the pitch-black, suffocating space for hours. When the homeowner returned the next afternoon and performed his security sweep, Cody was still alive and trapped inside the chimney. But Cody had remained completely silent. Perhaps he was too exhausted from hours of struggling to scream, or perhaps he was terrified that if he made a noise, the homeowner would find him and attack him or call the police. He simply stayed quiet, hoping the homeowner would leave the house again so he could find a way to make noise for help. But when the homeowner turned on the heat, he did not realize that his heating system was connected to a fireplace that immediately ignited a fire at the base of the chimney. The moment the fire started, thick, hot smoke and intense heat began to rise up the chimney, straight toward Cody. Cody began to choke and panic. In his desperation to escape the rising heat and toxic carbon monoxide, he began to thrash around. But his frantic movements only caused him to lose his footing and slip further down into the narrowing chimney, closer and closer to the growing flames. Within seconds, the heat became unbearable. Cody was caught in the direct path of the fire. The scream the homeowner heard was the sound of Cody burning alive inside the chimney. The homeowner tried frantically to put the fire out, but by the time he managed to extinguish it and emergency services arrived, it was far too late. Cody had succumbed to severe burns and smoke inhalation. He died inside the chimney, trapped in the very place he had tried to use to break into a home. It was a horrific tragedy that shocked the local community and left the homeowner traumatized by the memory of those desperate screams. Now, let us move to our third and final story, which takes us to the edge of a frozen river in St. Petersburg, Russia. The date is the 19th of January, 2022. It is late in the evening, and a 40-year-old mother named Anna Uskova is standing in a clearing in the woods. The weather is brutal. It is the dead of winter in Russia, and the temperature is well below freezing. Snow is falling heavily, and a biting wind is cutting through the trees. But despite the freezing conditions, Anna and her family are out here for a very specific reason. They are preparing to perform a sacred religious ceremony. In Russia, January 19th is the day of the Orthodox Epiphany. On this day, thousands of people across the country participate in a purification ritual. The ritual involves carving a cross-shaped hole into the thick ice of a frozen body of water. Participants then jump into the freezing water, dunk themselves 3 times in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and then climb back out. It is believed that this ritual washes away sins, strengthens the body, and protects the soul from evil spirits for the coming year. Usually, Anna and her family would perform this ritual with their local church community. The church would organize a large event, choosing a safe location, setting up wooden steps into the water, and ensuring that medical staff and rescue divers were on standby just in case anything went wrong. But this year, Anna wanted something different. She wanted a quiet, intimate ceremony with just her husband and her young children. She felt that doing it privately in the beautiful, snow-covered woods would make the experience more spiritual and memorable for her kids. They had found what they thought was the perfect spot next to the frozen Oradezh River. When they arrived, they were surprised to find that they were completely alone in the beautiful, peaceful woods. Anna set up some lights and a video camera on a tripod to record the moment. In the video, Anna walks into the frame, kneels down to comfort her shivering, nervous kids, and promises to go first to show them how easy it is. She walks to the edge of the cross-shaped hole, makes the sign of the cross over her chest, and jumps feet first into the dark water. She plunged under and disappeared. Seconds passed with no sign of her, and her family began to scream. What they did not realize was that the river had a raging, powerful undercurrent flowing beneath the ice. The moment Anna jumped, the fast-flowing current grabbed her legs and pulled her sideways under the thick, solid ice sheet. She was trapped in the pitch-black, freezing water with no way to find her way back to the opening. Her husband rushed to the hole and jumped in, but the freezing water and strong current forced him to climb back out to avoid being swept away too. Rescue divers and local authorities searched the river for hours under the ice, but it was a hopeless task. Anna's body has never been recovered. The video of her final moments remains a chilling reminder of how quickly a beautiful family tradition can turn into a tragedy when basic safety is ignored. These three stories show us that danger is not always where we expect it to be. Sometimes it is hidden beneath a familiar road, inside the walls of our own homes, or beneath the beautiful, serene ice of a quiet river. It is a sobering reminder that our world is full of hidden hazards, and a single decision to step into an unfamiliar or unsafe place can change everything in an instant. Imagine having your entire life ahead of you with loving parents, great friends, and a bright future in a creative field you love, only to suddenly drift into a series of bizarre actions that no one can explain. This is the story of Bryce Laspisa, a 19-year-old college student whose life seemed almost perfect on the surface, but ended up becoming one of the most hotly debated and baffling mysteries in modern American history. To really understand what happened, we have to look at who Bryce was before everything changed. They settled down in Laguna Niguel, California, which is an upscale, exceptionally quiet suburb in Orange County, known for its pristine streets, manicured lawns, and incredibly safe neighborhoods. It is the kind of place where parents feel comfortable raising their families, and Mike and Karen Laspisa had poured all of their love, energy, and resources into their only child, Bryce. He was their pride and joy, their entire world. As Bryce grew up, he was an active, happy kid. He spent his days skateboarding, hanging out with friends, and showing an incredible natural talent for art. His parents noticed early on that Bryce had a unique way of looking at the world. He was not just drawing doodles, he was creating complex figures and designs that showed a mature grasp of space and color. By the time he was in high school, he had transitioned from traditional paper and pencils to digital mediums, mastering graphic design programs with ease. He could spend hours in front of his computer screen, completely lost in his creations. Mike and Karen encouraged his passion and supported his dream of pursuing a career in graphic design. When he graduated from high school, they helped him look for the perfect college, and they settled on Sierra College in Rocklin, California, which is located in Placer County just outside of Sacramento. The school had an outstanding graphic design program and a welcoming campus community, which made it the ideal place for Bryce to start his adult life. In the summer of 2013, Bryce returned home to Laguna Niguel to spend the break with his parents. He had just finished his freshman year, and he was doing exceptionally well. During his first year at Sierra College, Bryce had made a lot of friends. He was living in an off-campus apartment with a great roommate named Sean, and he had started dating a wonderful, caring girl named Kim. Bryce and Kim were deeply in love, and their relationship was strong. To Mike and Karen, it seemed like their son was truly living his best life and was on a clear path to success. He was happy, healthy, and excited about his future. In mid-August of 2013, the summer was coming to an end, and it was time for Bryce to head back to Sierra College to start his sophomore year. Mike and Karen helped their beloved son pack up all of his belongings into the family car, a silver 2003 Toyota Highlander. Once the trunk was loaded with clothes, books, and his art supplies, all three of them hopped inside and made the long 7-hour drive north to the campus in Rocklin. The drive was a familiar routine, and the atmosphere in the car was light and optimistic. They talked about his upcoming classes, his artistic projects, and his plans for the new school year. Once they arrived in Rocklin, Mike and Karen helped Bryce move into his apartment, organizing his clothes, setting up his computer workstation, and making sure he had everything he needed. When it was time to say goodbye, they gave him big hugs and kisses, wished him luck for the semester, and told him how much they loved him. On their drive back down to Laguna Niguel, Mike and Karen talked about how proud they were of Bryce and how secure they felt knowing he was doing so well. But the problem was, this peaceful reality would not last. Just a couple of days after his parents dropped him off, those closest to Bryce began to notice a drastic and alarming change in his behavior. It started when his roommate Sean and his girlfriend Kim noticed that Bryce was acting very erratically. Specifically, he began drinking massive quantities of hard alcohol. Now, Bryce was not a complete saint, and like many college kids his age, he liked to party and drink occasionally. But the sheer volume of alcohol he was consuming now was different. It was dark, heavy drinking, and it seemed to serve a purpose other than just having fun. Along with the heavy drinking, Bryce had also started experimenting with a powerful prescription stimulant called Vyvanse. Vyvanse is normally prescribed to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but Bryce did not have this condition. He was taking the drug illegally, using it to stay awake for days at a time so he could play video games and avoid sleeping. The combination of intense sleep deprivation, heavy alcohol consumption, and a powerful stimulant began to take a massive toll on Bryce's physical and mental health. His personality began to morph right before the eyes of his friends. He went from being a relaxed, friendly, and creative young man to someone who was constantly anxious, skittish, and intensely paranoid. He would pace around the apartment, looking over his shoulder, and acting as if some unseen danger was looming over him. Sean and Kim tried to confront him about this sudden change. They asked him what was going on, why he was drinking so much, and why he was taking these drugs. But Bryce would always brush them off, saying that nothing was wrong and that he was just doing what he wanted to do. He insisted it was not a big deal. Sean and Kim were not convinced. They knew Bryce, and they could tell that he was trying to numb himself or cope with some deep, hidden stressor that he refused to talk about. And so, things continued to spiral. By August 28th, which was about 2 weeks after his parents had moved him back to school, the situation reached a critical breaking point. Bryce and Sean were alone in their apartment, sitting in the living room. It was a normal afternoon, but the atmosphere was incredibly tense. Suddenly, Bryce looked at Sean and said he wanted to give him something. He reached up, took his diamond earrings out of his ears, and handed them to Sean. Sean was completely stunned. He knew these earrings were incredibly valuable, and more importantly, they were a gift from Bryce's mother, Karen. Sean tried to refuse, telling Bryce that he could not accept them because they meant too much to him and his family. But Bryce insisted, telling Sean that he wanted him to have them. Before Sean could even process this strange gesture, Bryce stood up, grabbed his Xbox video game console, placed it on the table in front of Sean, and told him to take that as well. At this point, Sean was deeply alarmed. Giving away valuable, personal belongings is a well-known warning sign that someone might be planning to harm themselves or end their life. Sean tried to ask Bryce what was going on, but Bryce ignored the questions and pulled out his phone. He began aggressively and frantically texting someone, his fingers flying across the screen with an intense, frantic energy. After a few minutes of this, Bryce looked up from his screen and coldly told Sean that he had just broken up with Kim. This piece of news made absolutely no sense to Sean. Bryce and Kim were deeply in love, they doted on each other constantly, and they had just been hanging out earlier that day with no signs of trouble. This sudden text message breakup felt impulsive, chaotic, and completely wrong. Sean realized that Bryce was in the middle of some sort of mental health crisis, and he knew he could not handle this situation alone. He needed to get in touch with Bryce's parents immediately. However, he did not want to call them right in front of Bryce and risk angering him, so Sean waited. Soon after the breakup text, Bryce announced that he was going to drive over to Kim's apartment, which was a short distance away, to talk to her. As soon as Bryce walked out the door, Sean grabbed his phone and called Karen Laspisa. When Karen answered, Sean explained everything that had been happening over the past 2 weeks. He told her about the heavy drinking, the Vyvanse abuse, the paranoia, and how Bryce had just given away his diamond earrings and his Xbox before abruptly breaking up with Kim. Sean emphasized that he was not trying to get Bryce in trouble, but he was genuinely terrified for his friend's safety and felt that his parents needed to step in and do something. Karen was shocked and deeply alarmed by this phone call. She had no idea her son was struggling with substance abuse or acting this way. She thanked Sean for his honesty and promised to reach out to Bryce immediately. But before Karen could even dial her son's number, her phone rang. It was Kim, Bryce's now ex-girlfriend. Kim was crying and sounding incredibly distressed. She told Karen that Bryce had just arrived at her apartment and he was acting so bizarrely and erratically that she was terrified to let him drive. Kim said she had actually managed to take his car keys away from him because she felt he was in no mental state to be operating a vehicle. She described Bryce as looking completely blank, staring right through her and speaking in a way that did not make any sense. Karen's heart sank. She now had two separate, independent phone calls from the people closest to her son, both saying the exact same thing. Bryce was losing his grip on reality. Karen desperately asked Kim to put Bryce on the phone. When Bryce finally answered, his voice sounded surprisingly calm and normal, which only made the situation more confusing. Karen asked him what was going on, why his friends were so worried, and why he was at Kim's apartment acting so strangely. Bryce told his mother that Kim was just upset because they had broken up and that she was exaggerating his behavior. He said it was just a messy breakup and that he simply wanted to go back to his own apartment, but Kim was refusing to give him his car keys. He begged his mother to tell Kim to return his keys so he could just leave. Karen was torn. She knew her son was likely downplaying the situation, and she felt a deep sense of dread. She told Bryce that she was going to book a flight and fly up to Rockland first thing the next morning to see him in person and help him. But as soon as she said this, Bryce's demeanor changed. He became incredibly intense and told her absolutely not. He said he had a lot to talk to her about, but he insisted that she must not come up there until they had that conversation. Karen asked him what he needed to talk about, but Bryce refused to elaborate, saying only that they would talk later. This cryptic refusal to explain himself was highly uncharacteristic of Bryce, who had always been very open and honest with his parents. Feeling desperate, Karen handed the phone to her husband, Mike, hoping he could get through to their son. Mike spoke to Bryce, asking him if he was okay and what was happening. Bryce repeated the same story, claiming he had just broken up with his girlfriend and needed his keys so he could go home. From Mike's perspective, Bryce sounded completely coherent and calm. Mike believed that perhaps the situation was just a typical emotional reaction to a difficult breakup, and that his friends might be overreacting out of concern. Mike told Karen that they should probably just have Kim give Bryce his keys back so he could go to sleep in his own bed and they could sort everything out the next day. Reluctantly, Karen agreed. She got back on the phone, spoke with Kim, and asked her to return the keys to Bryce. Kim complied, and Bryce left her apartment. At around 11:30 that night, Karen called Bryce one more time to check on him. He was in his car, and she told him to go straight home and to call her the moment he walked through his apartment door so she would know he was safe. Bryce promised he would. At about 1 o'clock in the morning on August 29th, Bryce called his mother back and told her that he was safe inside his apartment. Karen and Mike breathed a massive sigh of relief, told their son they loved him, and went to sleep, believing the crisis had passed. But the next morning, the nightmare truly began. At around 11 o'clock on the morning of August 29th, Karen's phone rang. It was an automated notification from their insurance company letting them know that roadside assistance had been dispatched to their 2003 Toyota Highlander, which was the car Bryce was driving. Karen was immediately confused and worried. Bryce was supposed to be asleep in his apartment in Rockland. Why would he need roadside assistance? She tried calling Bryce, but his phone went straight to voicemail. She then called his roommate, Sean, to see if Bryce was still asleep. When Sean answered, he delivered a devastating piece of news. Bryce was not there, and he had never actually come home the previous night. The phone call at 1 in the morning, where Bryce had assured his mother he was safe in his apartment, had been a complete lie. Panicking, Mike and Karen realized they had to find their son. They decided to log into their online banking account to see if Bryce had used the credit card they had given him for emergencies, hoping to track his movements. Sure enough, they saw a very recent transaction from earlier that morning. It was a charge at an auto repair shop in a tiny town called Buttonwillow, California. Buttonwillow is a small, dusty desert community located right off Interstate 5, about halfway between Sierra College in Rocklin and their home in Laguna Niguel. This meant that instead of going home to his apartment, Bryce had got into his car and started driving south towards his parents' house. It seemed he was trying to make the 7-hour drive to see them in person, likely to talk about whatever mysterious burden he was carrying. But something had gone wrong along the way in Buttonwillow. Karen immediately called the auto repair shop listed on the bank statement. A mechanic named Christian answered the phone. Karen explained who she was and asked if he had seen a 19-year-old red-haired boy driving a 2003 Toyota Highlander. Christian confirmed that he had indeed helped Bryce just a couple of hours earlier. Christian explained that Bryce had called for roadside assistance because his car had run completely out of gas on the highway. Christian had driven out to a rest stop where Bryce had pulled over, delivered 3 gallons of fuel, and charged the card. Karen asked if Bryce had mentioned where he was going, but Christian said they had barely spoken. He had simply delivered the gas and left. However, Christian was a kind and empathetic man. Seeing how frantic and terrified Karen was on the phone, he offered to drive back out to the rest stop, which was about 15 minutes away, to see if Bryce was still there, even though it had been hours since their encounter. Karen was incredibly grateful and accepted his offer. Christian got into his truck and drove to the rest stop. He did not expect to find the young man still there, as anyone who had run out of gas would usually continue their journey once they had fuel. But when Christian pulled into the rest stop parking lot, he was shocked to see the silver Toyota Highlander still parked there. Christian walked up to the driver's side window and looked inside. Bryce was sitting in the driver's seat, his hands on the steering wheel, staring completely blankly out the windshield into the empty desert landscape. He looked like he was in a trance. Christian knocked on the window, which startled Bryce. He rolled the window down, and Christian told him that his parents were worried sick and that he needed to speak with them. Christian dialed Karen's number on his own phone and handed it to Bryce. When Karen heard her son's voice, she was overwhelmed with emotion and confusion. She demanded to know what he was doing, why he was just sitting in a rest stop in Buttonwillow instead of driving home or going back to school. Bryce had no real explanation. He spoke in flat, monosyllabic answers, saying he was not doing anything and was just sitting there. Karen, realizing that her son was in some sort of mental paralysis, begged him to go fill his tank with gas and drive the remaining 3 hours home to Laguna Niguel. Bryce agreed, saying he would do that right away. He handed the phone back to Christian, who assured Karen that he would make sure Bryce got on his way. Christian watched as Bryce started his engine, but as Christian drove away, he looked in his rearview mirror and noticed that Bryce did not actually pull out of the parking spot. He just turned the engine off and went back to staring out the window. Christian felt uneasy, but he had his own work to do, so he returned to his shop. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Bryce had still not arrived at his parents' house, and the drive from Buttonwillow should have only taken about 3 hours. Karen and Mike tried calling his phone repeatedly, but it rang and went to voicemail every single time. They were now completely consumed by fear. They waited, hoping against hope that he was just stuck in heavy Southern California traffic. But by 6 o'clock that evening, with still no sign of Bryce and no answer on his phone, they decided they could no longer wait. They called the police and officially reported Bryce Laspisa as a missing person. The police began their investigation by contacting AT&T to run an emergency ping on Bryce's cell phone. They wanted to pinpoint his exact coordinates using nearby cell towers. When the results came back, everyone was stunned. Bryce's phone was still in Buttonwillow, California. It had barely moved. It was now pinging in the parking lot of a local hotel just a few miles away from the rest stop where Christian had found him hours earlier. The local sheriff's deputies were dispatched to the hotel parking lot to locate the vehicle and check on Bryce. When the deputies arrived, they found the Toyota Highlander parked in the middle of the lot. Just as before, Bryce was sitting in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead. The deputies approached the car, knocked on the window, and asked Bryce to step out. To their surprise, Bryce was completely cooperative. He was polite, friendly, and spoke clearly. He did not appear to be under the influence of any substances. The deputies conducted a series of field sobriety tests, which Bryce passed with ease. They asked him if they could search his vehicle, and Bryce calmly gave them permission. The deputies thoroughly searched the SUV, but they found absolutely no drugs, no alcohol, and nothing illegal or suspicious. When they asked Bryce what he was doing, just sitting in a parking lot all day, he shrugged and said he was just passing the time and resting. The deputies realized that while Bryce was acting strangely by sitting in a parking lot for hours, he was an adult, he was sober, and he had not committed any crime. They could not legally detain him. However, they knew his parents had filed a missing persons report and were terrified. One of the deputies told Bryce that he needed to call his mother right then and there to let her know he was okay. Bryce became visibly reluctant and anxious, showing a strong aversion to speaking with his parents. But the deputy insisted, and Bryce finally dialed his mother's number. As soon as the call connected, the deputy took the phone from Bryce's hand. The deputy spoke to Karen, telling her that he was standing with her son, that Bryce was completely sober, healthy, and cooperative. He explained that they had searched his car and found nothing wrong, and that they had no legal reason to hold him. The deputy then handed the phone back to Bryce so he could speak to his mother. Karen, desperate and confused, asked Bryce why he was still in Buttonwillow after all this time. Bryce offered no real answers, only saying he would be home soon and that she should not worry. Karen, realizing she could not force him to explain himself over the phone, pleaded with him to just get some food, buy a cup of coffee, and drive home. Bryce agreed, promising her that he would make the drive. The deputies, satisfied that Bryce was safe and had promised to go home, wished him luck and left the scene. An hour later, Christian, the mechanic, called Karen back to see if Bryce had made it home. When Karen told him that Bryce had actually spent the whole day in Buttonwillow and had just been visited by the police, Christian was deeply concerned. He volunteered to drive back to the hotel parking lot to make sure Bryce had actually left this time. Karen told him it was not necessary, but Christian felt a strong pull to help. He drove over to the hotel, and to his frustration, he found Bryce still parked in the exact same spot, staring into the darkness. This time, Christian did not sugarcoat things. He parked his truck, walked up to Bryce's window, and told him in a very firm, commanding voice that he needed to go home. He told Bryce that his behavior was hurting his parents and that he was going to stand there and watch him pull out of the lot and that he was going to follow him to make sure he got onto the highway. Bryce, perhaps realizing he had no other choice, started his car and finally pulled out of the parking lot. Christian got into his truck and followed close behind. He watched as Bryce navigated the streets and successfully merged onto Interstate 5 South, heading toward Laguna Niguel. Christian followed the silver SUV for several miles, watching it maintain a steady speed and drive perfectly normally. Feeling satisfied that Bryce was finally on his way home, Christian pulled up alongside him, waved goodbye, and then took the exit to head back to Buttonwillow. Shortly after Christian left, Karen called Bryce to keep him awake and monitor his progress. She told him that she wanted him to describe the road signs and landmarks he was passing so she could track his journey and know he was getting closer. But Bryce refused. He told her that it was too dark, that he could not see anything out his windows, and that he did not know where he was. This made no sense, as Interstate 5 is heavily marked with massive, reflective green signs. Karen and Mike grew increasingly frustrated and worried by his evasiveness, but Bryce remained tight-lipped. At around 2 o'clock in the morning on August 30th, Bryce called his parents. He told them that he was incredibly tired and could not keep his eyes open. He said he was going to pull off the highway to take a nap in his car and would resume the drive as soon as he rested. Karen and Mike, knowing their son had been awake for nearly 24 hours and had been through an incredibly and stressful couple of days, realized it was safer for him to sleep than to risk falling asleep at the wheel. They told him to pull over in a safe, well-lit area, sleep for a few hours, and call them the absolute moment he woke up. Bryce promised he would, and they hung up. This was the last time Karen and Mike Laspisa would ever speak to their son. By 8 o'clock that morning, Karen and Mike had still not received a call. They tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. They tried to comfort themselves by thinking that he was just exhausted and sleeping deeply. But their hope was shattered when the doorbell rang. When Mike opened the door, he was met by a police officer. The officer asked if they were the owners of a 2003 Toyota Highlander. When Mike confirmed they were and that their son Bryce was driving it, the officer delivered a devastating blow. The vehicle had been found hours earlier, crashed at the bottom of a 25-foot cliff near Castaic Lake. Castaic Lake is a large reservoir located in the mountains just off Interstate 5, about halfway between Buttonwillow and Laguna Niguel. The details of the crash scene were incredibly baffling and deeply unsettling. The SUV was lying on its side at the bottom of the ravine. The emergency response team had searched the vehicle and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of Bryce. There was no driver, no body, and no immediate indication of where he had gone. Inside the vehicle, investigators found his cell phone and his laptop. On the road above the cliff, they found his wallet and his duffel bag, which contained his clothes. It appeared that these items had been thoroughly rummaged through, as if someone had been looking for something specific before abandoning them. The rear window of the SUV had been shattered from the inside, and there were 2 small drops of blood on the interior of the car, suggesting that Bryce had survived the crash with minor injuries and had crawled out through the broken back window to escape the wreckage. But the most disturbing revelation came from the physical evidence of the crash itself. Investigators analyzed the tire tracks on the dirt road leading up to the cliff's edge. There were no skid marks, which meant Bryce had never hit the brakes. In fact, traffic cameras and forensic analysis of the vehicle's computer revealed that Bryce had actually accelerated right before going over the edge. He had intentionally driven his car off the cliff. To the investigators, this looked like a clear-cut tragic case of a failed suicide attempt. They theorized that Bryce, overwhelmed by whatever mental health crisis or secret he was harboring, had driven to Castaic Lake, accelerated off the cliff to end his life, survived the impact with minor injuries, and then, in a state of shock or desperation, walked into the deep waters of the lake and drowned. But Mike and Karen could not accept this theory. It did not align with the son they knew. Just 2 weeks earlier, Bryce had been happy, excited for his sophomore year, and full of plans for the future. He had a supportive family, a girlfriend who cared for him, and a passion for his art. Suicide seemed completely out of character. They began to wonder if Bryce had gotten himself involved in something dangerous during those 2 weeks back at school. What did he mean when he told his mother that he had a lot to talk to her about, but that she must not come up to see him until they did? Was he running from someone? Was he being threatened? Did the rummage through duffel bag and wallet suggest that someone else had been at the crash scene? A massive, unprecedented search operation was launched around Castaic Lake and the rugged terrain surrounding the crash site. For days, hundreds of search and rescue volunteers, police officers on horseback, ATVs, and foot combed the brush. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras flew overhead, and dive teams searched the dark, murky depths of Castaic Lake. Despite their exhaustive efforts, they found absolutely no trace of Bryce. No clothing, no footprints, no body. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. On the 9th day of the search, investigators decided to bring in a specialized bloodhound to see if it could pick up a scent trail from the crash site. The dog was given an article of Bryce's clothing to sniff. Immediately, the bloodhound caught the scent at the wreckage of the Highlander. It began to lead its handler down the steep ravine away from the road and straight toward the shoreline of Castaic Lake. The dog then followed the shoreline until it reached a massive concrete dam and bridge that spanned across the water. It crossed the bridge, its nose glued to the ground, and continued down a dirt access road on the other side. The scent trail led all the way to a busy truck stop located near the highway. And then, right in the middle of the truck stop parking lot, the bloodhound stopped. It began circling, indicating that the scent trail had gone completely cold. The investigators were stunned. To ensure this was not a mistake or a false lead, they brought in a second, completely independent bloodhound that had not been involved in the first search. This second dog was given Bryce's scent, and it proceeded to follow the exact same path. It went from the crash site down to the lake, across the dam and bridge, down the access road, and directly to the truck stop, where it also stopped. This physical evidence completely shattered the simple suicide by drowning theory. Bryce had survived the crash, climbed up the ravine, walked a significant distance around the lake, crossed the bridge, made his way to a truck stop, and from there his scent vanished. This strongly suggested that he had gotten into a vehicle either by hitchhiking, being picked up by someone he knew, or perhaps being abducted. Despite this incredible breakthrough, the lead went completely cold. Investigators checked the surveillance cameras at the truck stop, but they were of low quality and did not show anyone matching Bryce's description getting into a truck or car. There were no records of hitchhikers being picked up, and none of his friends or family had been contacted by him. After 3 weeks of intensive searching and investigation with no new leads and no sign of life, the official search for Bryce Laspisa was called off. In the years since his disappearance, several prominent theories have emerged, each trying to make sense of the bizarre and contradictory evidence. The first theory is that Bryce was indeed experiencing a severe, drug-induced psychotic break. The combination of heavy alcohol consumption, extreme sleep deprivation, and the abuse of Vyvanse can trigger acute psychosis, paranoia, and delusions in young adults. Proponents of this theory believe that Bryce's erratic behavior, his refusal to go home, his long periods of sitting in parking lots staring into space, and his decision to drive off the cliff were all the result of a complete loss of touch with reality. They suggest that after surviving the crash, confused, disoriented, and perhaps suffering from a traumatic brain injury or amnesia, he wandered away, reached the truck stop, and either hopped onto a truck or wandered into the wilderness where he eventually perished, or is living as an unidentified person, unaware of his own identity. The second theory is that Bryce intentionally staged his disappearance to start a new life off the grid. According to this theory, Bryce was facing some immense secret pressure or trouble that he felt he could not escape or face his parents with. Perhaps he had run into financial trouble, was involved in illegal activities, or simply wanted to escape the expectations of his life. By giving away his prized possessions, breaking up with his girlfriend, and driving off a cliff, he may have been trying to make everyone believe he was dead so that no one would look for him. He then walked to the truck stop, caught a ride with a long-haul trucker, and fled to another part of the country to start over with a new identity. However, his parents strongly reject this idea, stating that Bryce loved his family deeply and would never subject them to the agonizing, endless pain of not knowing if their only child is alive or dead. The third, and perhaps most sinister theory, is that Bryce was a victim of foul play. Supporters of this theory point to the rummaged-through duffel bag and wallet found on the road above the crash site. They suggest that Bryce may have been running from someone or trying to meet someone in Buttonwillow, which would explain his reluctance to leave that small town. Perhaps he was being followed, and the crash was not a suicide attempt, but the result of him being chased off the road. They believe that after he escaped the wreckage, he was intercepted by those who were pursuing him, or perhaps he met a dangerous individual at the truck stop who took advantage of his vulnerable, injured state, leading to his demise. For Mike and Karen Laspisa, the passage of time has brought no peace, only a lingering, heavy silence filled with unanswered questions. They have spent over a decade searching for their son, keeping his story alive in the media and hoping for a miracle. Every day, they are forced to live with the haunting memory of those final, agonizing phone calls, wondering what it was that Bryce so desperately needed to tell them and why he could not just make it home. The silver Toyota Highlander at the bottom of the cliff remains a tragic monument to a young life interrupted, and the silent waters of Castaic Lake hold their secrets close. To this day, the case of Bryce Laspisa remains open, but the physical trail has gone completely cold. There are no active search parties in the mountains, no new scent tracks for the bloodhounds to follow, and no fresh credit card transactions to trace. What started as a promising college sophomore preparing for his future dissolved over the course of 2 weeks into an absolute mystery. Every small town along Interstate 5, every rest stop, every dusty parking lot where Bryce sat staring into space serves as a quiet reminder of those final hours. Investigators still look at the case files, hoping that one day a new witness will come forward, or that someone who was at that Button Willow truck stop on the morning of August 30th, 2013, will remember seeing a 19-year-old red-haired boy with a unique tattoo looking lost and disoriented. The impact of Bryce's disappearance on his family is immeasurable. Mike and Karen have dedicated their lives to finding answers, creating social media pages, speaking to news outlets, and working with private investigators. They have had to navigate the cruel duality of holding on to hope while simultaneously facing the stark reality of the crash scene and the cliff. They often look back at the photos taken during that summer of 2013 when Bryce was laughing, painting, and enjoying his time in Laguna Niguel. They ask themselves what they could have done differently, if there were subtle signs they missed, or if there was some way they could have prevented him from making that final, fateful drive. But as the years turn into decades, the silence only grows louder. The mystery of what Bryce wanted to talk to his mother about remains the central, unresolved riddle of the entire tragedy. It is the key that could unlock everything, explaining his sudden paranoia, his erratic behavior, his gifts to his roommate, and his reluctance to return home. It is a secret that Bryce took with him when he climbed out of the shattered back window of his Highlander and walked down the access road toward the truck stop. The story of Bryce Laspisa is a cautionary tale about how quickly a life can change, how fragile our sense of security can be, and how some secrets are so heavy they can pull a person completely off their course. It is a narrative that continues to capture the imagination of millions of people around the world, all hoping that one day the truth will finally be revealed and that Mike and Karen will finally get the peace and the answers they have been desperately searching for. Until that day comes, Bryce remains a shadow on the highway, a memory of a red-haired boy who drove into the California desert and vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but questions, a broken car, and a trail of scent that stopped at a truck stop parking lot. If you or anyone you know has any information regarding the disappearance of Bryce Laspisa, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, investigators urge you to contact the local authorities. Even the smallest detail, a remembered face from a truck stop, a conversation on the road, or a sighting in a different state, could be the final piece of the puzzle that brings Bryce home and provides closure to a family that has suffered for far too long. The mystery of that August night continues to linger, suspended in the dry air of the Central Valley, waiting for the day the silence is finally broken. More than a decade later, no one knows what really happened to Bryce Laspisa. And perhaps the most concerning part is that whatever he needed to say to his parents that night, he never had the chance to say it. Let me know your theory in the comments, as this case still feels unresolved. One night in December of 2009, a man was digging through a pile of papers and photo albums inside of an RV that was parked in Texas. The man had recently bought this trailer after its previous owner had died. And so now he was finding it was full of junk that he was trying to sort through. And as he rifled through the documents, he stumbled on a stack of old notebooks. He opened one up and he began to read it. And as he did, he felt his heartbeat pick up because the notebooks were actually diaries. They were full of handwritten rantings about demons and monsters and a deal with the devil. But that wasn't what scared him. What really scared the guy was this writer's horrifying confession. On the night of the 24th of July, 1987, a 30-year-old woman named Susan Woods stood at the entrance to a local fair in a little city called Hyco, located in central Texas. She was there with her best friend and her best friend's boyfriend. The three of them were just standing there trying to decide if they wanted to continue to stay or if they should just leave. As they stood there, they could hear people having fun on all the rides. There were kids laughing and screaming. It was a Friday night, and they had chosen to come here. This was supposed to be their fun activity for the evening. But so far, the night really had not been that great. Susan's best friend, a woman named Cindy Hallmark, and her boyfriend, a man named Roy Hayes, had convinced Susan to come out with them to this fair because Susan's life, of late, had been really quite bad. She was in the middle of a very ugly divorce, and the new guy that she had been dating had wound up being very pushy when it came to physical intimacy, and so she had recently dumped him too. And so Susan's life, certainly her relationships anyway, were in pretty rough shape. Cindy and Roy had convinced Susan to come out with them and, for at least one night, just come enjoy this fair. Forget about everything else and just have some fun. And so Susan had agreed to go. However, once they actually got to the fair and the three of them were walking around, playing games and going into the haunted house and doing all the things you do at a fair, it had been Cindy, not Susan, who had ultimately said that she wasn't really having a good time. She said that she just had this really intense feeling that something bad was about to happen. It was like this constant anxiety, and she just couldn't shake it, and it was making it really hard to enjoy the night. And so that was why the trio was standing at the gate, wondering if it was even worth staying any longer. Ultimately, Roy finally just said, "You know what? Why don't we just leave and head back to Stephenville? That's where they all lived. It's where they grew up, too." He suggested they could go back to Stephenville and just drive around for a bit, and eventually they could go to the Dairy Queen restaurant and get some ice cream. When Roy suggested this, both Susan and Cindy thought it was a great idea. And so they left. They hopped in Roy's truck and began the drive back to Stephenville. About an hour and a half later, Susan, Cindy, and Roy walked into the Stephenville Dairy Queen. They ordered ice cream sundaes and then sat down at a booth. By this point, Cindy's feeling of dread, that feeling that something bad was going to happen, had mostly gone away. And so the mood was much lighter. And Susan especially was actually having a great night, the first one in a long time. It felt like the last 6 months or so had been some of the worst in Susan's entire life. Her ex-husband, Michael Woods, who she had been with since she was in her early 20s, had effectively abandoned her back in February. He had taken her car and also some expensive crystals that she had collected. And he had left behind a viciously mean tape recording of all the things he hated about her, along with dozens of cruel notes with insults on them hidden all over the place. And so Susan had filed for divorce. And then, instead of trying to get her car back from her husband, who was long gone, she just began doing a ton of overtime at the sandpaper factory where she worked in order to afford another car. And so in these few months immediately following the breakup with her ex, and with all this extra work she was doing, Susan had really fallen into a deep depression. But it had been Cindy and Roy who had helped her pull herself back together. Susan was naturally very shy, and she did not have a big social circle. But Cindy, on the other hand, was very extroverted, had a ton of friends, and a lot of close cousins. She had persuaded Susan to begin coming to their regular meetups with all her friends and cousins. The core group that typically attended these meetups was Cindy, Roy, Cindy's cousins, Regina and Scott Hatley, and then maybe one or two others. And collectively, they referred to themselves as the members of the round table, because often these meetups consisted of just spending the whole night sitting around Cindy's round kitchen table, talking and drinking. The first time Susan had gone, it had seemed like such a tight-knit group that she really just kind of felt like a third wheel and did not belong. But everyone had really treated her like she did belong. And these days, she did not miss a meetup because this was like her new community. It really made her happy. And so, slowly but surely, Susan had begun to feel better, largely because of these meetups. And so now, as she looked across the table at Cindy, jokingly trying to force-feed Roy all this ice cream, Susan just smiled. Roy was this big guy, but he was losing the fight, and he had chocolate sauce all over his chin. They were just kind of goofing around. And she just thought to herself, you know what? Tonight was a great night. My life is turning around. And suddenly, she had an idea. Susan stood up from the table and, without saying anything, she walked up to the counter and she promptly ordered a second hot fudge sundae. When she carried it back over to the table with a big grin on her face, Cindy and Roy kind of looked at her surprised and were kind of impressed even, which was exactly the reaction that Susan was hoping for. Normally, Susan was very conscious of her weight and wouldn't even finish one sundae. But tonight, she just felt like she had been set free. She was just going to have fun. But unfortunately for Susan, the ice cream sundaes were really the last fun thing she got to enjoy that entire weekend because she spent all day Saturday on the line at the sandpaper factory where she worked. And then all day Sunday, she was grocery shopping, doing laundry, and straightening up the house. By about 8 p.m. Sunday night, she had put away all of her laundry. She had made the bed and picked up the last few items off the bedroom floor. Her house was small, but it was finally starting to feel like hers again. When her ex-husband Michael had first left, even though he had gone 1,000 miles away to Indiana, she had felt afraid in her house like he might suddenly come back. And so she'd actually had Cindy sleep over at her house for a while to help her feel safe. And also, she asked Roy to literally nail all her windows shut. But despite fortifying her living space, what Susan couldn't escape from were all these awful little notes that Michael had left behind and hidden all over the house. All these awful messages, just basically telling Susan all these terrible things about her and how much he hated her. She kept finding them all the time. But as of right now, the house was neat and tidy. And Susan by this point believed she had found almost every note, or certainly close to every note. So, to celebrate, Susan headed over to the couch and sat down and turned on the TV. Her plan was just to watch a couple of shows and just enjoy the peace and quiet and then go to bed because tomorrow she would have to get up early for work. As she was sitting there flipping through the channels trying to figure out what she wanted to watch, she heard a knock on the front door. 2 days later, at 6 p.m. on the afternoon of July 28th, Susan's father, Joe Atkins, was at home when his phone rang. And when he picked it up, it was Susan's manager at the sandpaper factory, which was weird. The manager told him that he was calling because Susan had not shown up to work for the past 2 days and nobody could get a hold of her, and so he was wondering if Joe knew where she was. Joe frowned and said, no, he didn't know, but he would go find out. He hung up and he immediately dialed Susan's number. And when she didn't answer, he didn't think twice. He just put the phone down, grabbed his keys, hurried out to his truck, and started driving towards Susan's place. A half an hour later, Joe pulled up outside of Susan's house, and he went up to her front door. And when he knocked, nobody answered. But he could hear the TV on inside. And when he tried the doorknob, he found the door was unlocked. He opened the door up a little bit, and he poked his head inside and he called his daughter's name, but he didn't get a response. So, he stepped all the way inside. The house was basically clean, except there were snacks out on the coffee table and the TV was still on, and it was on pretty loud. But also, there were some cigarettes that had been burned out in an ashtray on the coffee table, and Joe knew his daughter didn't smoke. And so at this point, everything told him something was wrong. So Joe walked through the living room and into his daughter's bedroom. His daughter was not in there, but the bed was a mess. The sheets and the bedding had all been ripped off and were sitting in a heap on the floor, and the mattress itself was hanging off the box spring. Joe was about to leave and search the rest of the house when he noticed the bathroom door in the bedroom was open. Joe forced himself to step toward the door, and as he did, his heart began to hammer in his chest. And then when he leaned around the door and looked inside the bathroom, he just froze. For what felt like a very long time, but was very likely only a few seconds, Joe didn't move or breathe. Then it's like he broke out of his fog. He stumbled backwards. He ran to the living room, grabbed the phone, and he called 911. Sergeant Donnie Hensley of the Stephenville Police Department had just gotten home after a pretty long shift when he got a call from dispatch to head back out again. A homicide had just been called in, and every available officer had to head to the scene right away. The dispatcher did not have many details, but they did know that the victim was a young woman and that she had been found by her father inside of her home. When Hensley got to the address, he found there was an ambulance there and a couple of fire trucks and police cars and a whole bunch of police officers that were already out and about stringing up crime scene tape. But he also saw someone that he was not expecting to see. It was a friend of his, a guy he knew who volunteered at the town's golf course. His name was Joe Atkins. So he walked over and he asked Joe, like, "Hey, what are you doing here?" But the instant he asked that question, and when Joe turned around to look at him, Hensley understood why he was here. He suddenly remembered that Joe had a daughter. And based on the look on Joe's face, clearly his daughter was the murder victim. Joe had found her. Hensley was a hardened detective who had been to plenty of crime scenes by this point, and he had seen some terrible things. But the pure grief on his friend's face was too much for him to bear. He knew there was nothing he could do to take Joe's pain away. So instead, without saying anything, Hensley took Joe's hands, and the two men just stood there and prayed. And then, after a few minutes, he let go of Joe's hands. And then he turned and walked up Susan's front steps to begin the search for her killer. The crime scene unit was already inside of Susan's home, hard at work by the time Detective Hensley walked through the front door. A supervisor walked over and brought Hensley up to speed. They told him that Susan's body was in the bathroom, and from the looks of it, she'd been dead for a while. The front door had been unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that Susan may have let her killer inside. Detectives were now dividing up the house into quadrants to examine each part of the crime scene, and Hensley would be working primarily in the bedroom. But the supervisor warned Hensley that the crime itself was incredibly brutal, likely bordering on torture, and he should just mentally prepare himself. Hensley nodded, and for a moment he just stood there and collected himself and took stock of the scene. He looked over at the coffee table in the living room, and he saw it was covered with snacks, including a bag of potato chips, a pack of Twinkies, and an open Coke can. And there was an ashtray with 6 cigarette butts inside of it. It looked like more food and more cigarettes than one person would reasonably consume. And so maybe Susan had had company. But otherwise, the house was clean and pretty unremarkable, except for one thing that took Hensley a minute to notice. And what it was is all the windows were nailed shut from the inside. Susan clearly must have been scared of somebody breaking in. And so naturally, Hensley wondered if maybe the person she was scared of breaking in was the same person who wound up killing her. But if that was the case, why had she apparently opened the door for this person? At this point, Hensley moved into the bedroom. And as soon as he did, he could tell there had to have been a struggle in here because the mattress was hanging off the box spring, the sheets had been pulled off, and they were heaped up on the floor. And there were all these scuff marks on the floor that suggested the bed very likely had been moved, dragged around inside of the room. There was also a white extension cord lying on the mattress. And also there was this pillow that had all these strange black smudges on it. Hensley walked over and looked at this pillowcase, trying to figure out what the smudges could be, and then he realized it was mascara. The pillow must have been held over Susan's face to suffocate her. But when Hensley walked into the bathroom and saw what was in there, despite the warning he was given about how brutal it was, he still was taken aback and found himself gasping. Susan's body was draped over the side of the tub with her head still in the water. At first glance, it was obvious Susan was dead because her head and shoulders that were underwater were severely decomposed from being in the water. And so at this point, Hensley realized that whoever murdered Susan had likely sexually assaulted her, strangled her, smothered her, and then held her body underwater. This had been a savage attack committed by a monster. However, Hensley also realized that this monster, whoever had done this, had made at least one mistake because one of the crime scene techs that was in the bathroom was pointing at the tub with excitement. And when Hensley looked at what they were pointing at, you could see perfectly clearly there was a set of palm prints almost certainly left behind by the killer. The following morning, at around 10 a.m., Sergeant Hensley walked into the Stephenville police station and promptly filled up a paper cup from the bullpen water cooler and drank it down. It was over 90 degrees outside, and he had just spent all morning and a lot of the previous night canvassing the neighborhood where Susan had been murdered. But despite all their efforts, they really hadn't gotten much. Susan had been found on Tuesday, but nobody had reported seeing her on Tuesday or the Monday before or the Sunday before, which left a window of 3 days for this murder to have taken place. One of Susan's neighbors did remember seeing a, quote, large framed man park his truck near Susan's house on Sunday night, but that described a lot of the men in Stephenville, so that didn't really narrow anything down. Now, the police chief had not yet assigned a lead investigator to Susan's case, but because Sergeant Hensley knew Susan's father personally, he was hoping to stay involved. So, after drinking a second cup full of water, Hensley headed down the hall to the chief's office, where he asked to see Susan's autopsy report. The chief's secretary handed it over, and Hensley quickly began to thumb through the pages, but he quickly realized there really was almost nothing here that he didn't already know. The report confirmed that Susan had been sexually assaulted, but her body was so decomposed it was impossible to determine exactly how or when she had died. Although the coroner estimated she'd been in the tub for roughly 2 days. But right at that moment, another investigator named Lieutenant Ken Maltby walked up and grabbed the report right out of Hensley's hands. And before Hensley could protest, Maltby walked back to the bullpen and rapped his knuckles on a doorframe to get everybody's attention. Then Maltby announced that he would be taking over Susan's case. So everybody else, Hensley included, should back off. And Hensley did not like this. Not only because he had this closeness with Susan's father, but also because he had a feeling that Maltby was only interested in this case because he thought it would help his career. However, Maltby outranked Hensley, and Hensley already had a full caseload of work. So there really was very little he could do here. So, with a resigned sigh, he headed back to his desk. 2 days later, around 2 p.m. on July 31st, Sergeant Hensley stood in the back of a small crowd, sweating through his suit as Susan's casket was lowered into the ground. Hensley was at this funeral really to support Susan's father, Joe, because he was not really a part of the investigation. However, he couldn't help scanning the mourners through a detective's lens to see if anybody seemed suspicious. There was a group of people in their 20s and 30s that were standing towards the front, and Hensley assumed they must be Susan's friends. He remembered what one of Susan's neighbors had said about a large framed man, and he looked at all the men, taking note of their size. At the center of the group, there was a blonde woman who was sobbing. And Hensley recognized her as Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, who was leaning on her boyfriend, Roy Hayes. The two of them had actually come to the crime scene by coincidence on the day Susan's body was found, and they had totally broken down when they realized what had happened. But now, Hensley was suddenly noticing just how physically enormous Roy was. And so in that moment, Hensley thought to himself, if he was in charge of this case, he knew Roy would be somebody he'd take a close look at. But that was not his decision. But then Hensley noticed that there was actually one person who was conspicuously absent from this funeral, and that was Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. From what Hensley had heard around the station, nearly all of Susan's friends and family were convinced that it was Michael who was the killer. But there was a problem with this theory. Michael lived 1,000 miles away in Indianapolis. And word around the police station was that during that window of time where Susan was murdered over those 3 days, Michael was in Indianapolis and he was around loads of people who would vouch for him being in Indianapolis. Which meant that as far as Hensley knew, there really was no way for Michael to be the killer. And so Hensley just hoped that Lieutenant Maltby had another better suspect in mind. For the next few weeks, Sergeant Hensley focused on his own cases while still keeping tabs on Susan's. Every couple of days, her dad would call him up and ask why Michael hadn't been arrested yet. And Hensley would always tell him that the case was in good hands, and they're working on it. But as the weeks passed by with no arrests, Hensley started to wonder, what was going on here? Something needs to happen. Why is nothing happening? Then, one day in early October, so roughly 2 months after Susan's murder, Hensley walked into the bullpen to find Maltby celebrating. Not because of any progress in the case, though, but to celebrate his big promotion. Maltby was going to be the lead of a new narcotics unit, and his open cases that he had been working on were just going to be given to other investigators or filed away altogether. And so as Maltby accepted congratulations from other officers and just made a whole scene, all Sergeant Hensley could think was, well, what's going to happen to Susan's case? It could easily fall through the cracks here. And so, without even talking to Maltby, Hensley walked straight to the chief's office and asked to take the case over. The chief shrugged and just said, sure, you're welcome to try, so long as this case does not get in the way of his other work. Hensley agreed, and then went to get Susan's file. And then, after he had it in hand, he hurried back to his desk and began rifling through the pages. And he was stunned to find that there was almost nothing in there besides the original autopsy report. And that's when Hensley remembered that Lieutenant Maltby claimed to have this photographic memory. And so he almost never took notes. And so Hensley was basically going to have to start all over from square one. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Sergeant Hensley sat down in the kitchen of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, as Cindy poured them both a cup of coffee. And then Cindy started talking. And she had a lot to say. She was absolutely convinced that Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, was the killer. And she just could not understand why it was taking detectives so long to arrest him. Cindy said, you know, for most of Susan and Michael's relationship, Michael was just kind of a loser. He couldn't keep a job, and he'd just lift weights and play guitar shirtless in the front yard. However, when they had broken up, Michael had recorded this totally unhinged audio recording about how awful Susan was and left it for Susan, along with all these notes he had hid all around the house and the property, which also just said terrible things about Susan. And this behavior by Michael had scared Susan so much that she had asked Cindy and Cindy's boyfriend Roy to help nail all her windows shut, specifically to prevent Michael from coming into the house. Hensley listened and wrote everything Cindy said down, but he really wasn't as sold on the Michael Woods theory as everybody else in Stephenville seemed to be. And that was primarily because the police in Indianapolis had spoken to Michael, and apparently he had given them a rock-solid alibi. And so, realistically, it didn't make sense for him to be the killer. That said, Hensley was pretty confident that the killer had to be somebody Susan knew. The lack of forced entry, coupled with all the snacks and the Coke can and cigarettes on her coffee table, suggested that Susan might have entertained her murderer before they killed her. And so at this point, Hensley was much more interested in learning if there were other romantic interests in Susan's life, besides Michael. And when he asked Cindy that question, she said, yeah, there was one other guy. She said right before Susan was killed, she was seeing this bartender named J.C. Bowman. However, they'd only gone on a few dates. Cindy said that J.C. had put a lot of pressure on Susan to sleep with him, and so she had just broken up with him. And when Hensley heard this, he felt like this was really promising. And so when Cindy finished telling her J.C.'s story, he asked her if she knew where he could find J.C. And she said, yeah. And she gave him the address of the bar where he worked. 45 minutes later, Sergeant Hensley pulled up in front of the bar. It was still too early for business, but there was a delivery truck out front, and there were a few men who were unloading kegs and bringing them inside. And so Hensley walked up to these guys, and he asked if any of them knew a J.C. Bowman. And this tall, bearded man raised his hand and said, actually, that was him. A few minutes later, Hensley and J.C. were sitting at the empty bar. Hensley watched J.C.'s face very closely as he explained to him that he was here to talk about Susan. J.C. nodded and ran his fingers through his hair like he was nervous. And then he said his throat was dry and asked Sergeant Hensley if he wanted something to drink. Sergeant Hensley said he was okay. But J.C. got up, went behind the bar, and then came back with a can of Coke. And after sitting down and opening the drink up and taking a sip, J.C. also lit up a cigarette. And so immediately, Hensley thought of the Coke can that was on Susan's coffee table, as well as the ashtray full of cigarettes, despite the fact that Susan was not a smoker. And so the interview had barely even started, and Hensley was already very suspicious of J.C. So he decided to push pretty early and see how J.C. reacted under some serious pressure. And so right out the gate, he asked JC where he was on Sunday, July 26th, which was the day investigators at this point believed Susan was murdered based primarily on the autopsy report. And when JC was asked that, he swallowed and said he couldn't remember, which was possible. I mean, the murder happened 2 months earlier, but it didn't make JC look that good. So Hensley asked JC if it was true that he and Susan broke up ultimately because he, JC, had pressured her for sex. JC turned beet red and said he had never pressured Susan. He said they had been intimate, but just once in Susan's bathtub. And when Hensley heard this, he nearly dropped his pen. It seemed extremely suspicious that JC was claiming to have been intimate with Susan in the same bathtub where she was found dead. And so Hensley wondered if he was maybe trying to get ahead of the fact that his fingerprints would be found on or in that bathtub. Now, legally, Hensley knew he could not compel JC to offer up his fingerprints without charging him first, but he took a chance and just asked anyway. And to his surprise, JC said, "Yes, you can have my fingerprints," and he almost seemed relieved. He said, "Whatever you need to help solve Susan's murder, I'll do it." 2 hours later, Sergeant Hensley was back at his desk in the Stephenville police station looking at a card that had JC's finger and palm prints on it. And as he looked at it, he began thinking about those palm prints on Susan's bathtub. In 1987, fingerprints and palm prints were just much slower to process than they are today. And the closest lab that analyzed these prints was an hour and a half away in Fort Worth. And Hensley knew they were always working with a backlog. So his results could easily take months. But Hensley was not going to just sit around and wait because he had one more suspect he wanted to talk to. The following afternoon, Sergeant Hensley walked into an interrogation room at the police station and sat down across from Roy Hayes, who was Susan's best friend, Cindy's boyfriend. Hensley wanted to speak to Roy for 2 reasons. One, he matched the physical description of the large man seen near Susan's house around the time of her murder. And 2, there just weren't that many people who were close to Susan, and Roy saw her when she was both with Cindy and also when she would attend those members of the Round Table get-togethers. Now, that was not that incriminating, but Hensley knew that catching the killer was as much about ruling suspects out as it was about ruling them in. So that was really all he was trying to do here with Roy, is just maybe find a way to say, nope, not him. But before Hensley could even begin asking Roy questions, Roy just started talking. He told Hensley that he had been thinking about Susan's case nonstop. He said that his mind had been running wild with all the possible ways the killer could have gotten inside. And so now Roy was eager to share his theories. After all, he said he was the one who nailed those windows shut. So he knew where the weaknesses in her house were. And so Hensley said, "Okay, let's hear your theories." And Roy began listing all the ways a person might be able to get inside of Susan's house, including what Roy said was the most promising, which was a 6-inch crack in the window above the kitchen sink. And as Roy did this, all of a sudden, he was at the top of Hensley's suspect list. And when Roy was done rattling off all the ways he would break into Susan's house, Hensley asked him, "Where were you on the evening of Sunday, July 26th, and Hensley watched as Roy's expression changed from very intense to surprised as he realized he was now being asked for his own alibi. Roy started stumbling over another very long, rambly answer, and what he had to say ultimately just made him look even more guilty because Roy told Hensley that on the night Susan was killed, he had been over at a friend's house playing a game called Dungeons & Dragons. So today, people know Dungeons & Dragons as a harmless fantasy role-playing game. But at this time, in 1987, it was viewed very differently. In the late 1980s in America, there was this huge fear that certain games, books, and heavy metal songs were all linked to devil worship. The TV news ran regular stories across the country about how Dungeons & Dragons specifically encouraged players to cast spells and practice witchcraft. And the local paper in Stephenville had carried a full-page ad calling the game satanic. So when Roy told Hensley he had been playing Dungeons & Dragons on the night Susan was killed, Hensley immediately thought back to the horrible brutality of the crime scene. And he wondered if maybe Susan's murder could have been tied to some kind of dark ritual. And so Hensley looks at Roy and says, "Okay, "Well, are you prepared to give us your fingerprints?" And Roy said, "Yeah." A half an hour later, a very disappointed Sergeant Hensley watched Roy walk away from the station. Just like with JC, Roy had seemed incredibly suspicious at the start of the interview, but then he'd easily offered up his fingerprints, like he wasn't concerned at all about whether they'd match the killers. So Hensley was not sure what to expect in terms of results here. But he still sent Roy's prints off to the outside lab to be added to the queue behind JC's. Hensley was contemplating his next move when the station receptionist walked over and said that someone from the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department was on the line for him. They were following up on the inquiry he had made a few days earlier to double-check the alibi of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. Hensley eagerly ran to the phone, and when he heard what the officer had to say, he practically jumped out of his chair. Because according to the Indianapolis police officer, it was true that Michael said he had an alibi with lots of witnesses, but he had promised to provide the names and contact information for all those witnesses, and he had never done it. Which meant Michael's alibi, the same one Stephenville police used to rule him out as a suspect. Or, more specifically, they used the idea of his alibi, the belief that his alibi existed. That's what they used to rule him out. Well, clearly, it was totally... Lieutenant Ken Maltby, who was in charge of the case when this decision was made, had just completely dropped the ball. Somebody had to check Michael's alibi. On a bright morning in April of 1988, Sergeant Hensley walked out of the Indianapolis International Airport with a single duffel bag of luggage slung over his shoulder. He was here to try to collect the fingerprints of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, who was now Hensley's primary suspect. Hensley had been trying to coordinate the investigation into Michael from Stephenville, Texas, but it had proven to be kind of cumbersome, and so he decided to just take matters into his own hands and actually go to Indianapolis. He knew Michael did not have to submit to fingerprinting unless he was charged with a crime. So Hensley had come up with a plan. He was going to put Michael under surveillance and wait for him to do something illegal. Maybe he gets into a fight or an altercation, or he buys some marijuana, or even jaywalked, anything. Hensley would use it as an excuse to arrest him and get his prints. For days, Hensley sat in an unmarked van outside the house where Michael lived, watching the front door through a telephoto camera lens. But Michael and his roommates seemed pretty boring. They barely even left the house. Hensley was beginning to think that his big plan to catch Michael doing something illegal was a huge waste of time. It just was not going to happen. But then, one morning, he noticed some unusual activity in Michael's front yard. Michael and his roommates were laying out furniture and clothing on their front lawn, clearly getting ready for a yard sale. Sergeant Hensley was snapping photos of everything they were bringing out. And at one point, he saw something that gave him a rush of excitement because, through his lens, he spotted these crystal figurines that appeared to be the exact same type of crystal figurines that Michael had allegedly stolen from Susan's house in Stephenville when their marriage had ended and he had left to go to Indianapolis. Hensley practically laughed out loud. I mean, this was too easy. This was his chance. So he called the local police, and they stormed the yard sale, and they arrested Michael for theft. 2 weeks later, now back in Stephenville, Sergeant Hensley walked into the police station to start a shift, and he found a manila envelope waiting for him. It had a return address that said it was from the Texas DPS crime lab in Fort Worth, Texas, where he had sent all of the suspects' fingerprints. Hensley ripped open the envelope and dumped the contents onto the table. And as he began looking through them, he realized the lab had already analyzed all 3 sets of prints that he had sent in. They were Susan's ex-boyfriend, J.C. Bowman, her best friend's boyfriend, Roy Hayes, and her ex-husband, Michael Woods. Now, at this point, if Hensley had had to guess who the killer was, he would have guessed Michael. Because Michael is this enraged ex-husband who had left behind these terrible recordings and notes, and he had spooked Susan so badly at the end of their relationship, she had nailed her windows shut to keep him out. And then also, his alibi was sort of up in the air. They didn't really know if he had one or not. They hadn't been able to actually verify it or not yet. JC also had basically no alibi. He drank Coke, and he smoked cigarettes just like the killer had left in Susan's living room, or is believed to have been the killer who left those behind. And Roy, in virtue of playing Dungeons and Dragons, could potentially be involved in Satanism. And also, he seemed way too eager to talk about how he might break into Susan's house. However, for Hensley, he felt like one of these three men is the killer. He's about to get his answer. But as he read through each of these reports, he went from exhilaration to confusion and finally just total disbelief because none of these prints that he'd submitted matched the ones from Susan's tub. Hensley wanted so badly to solve this case, to give Susan's father, Joe, his friend, some closure, but now he felt like he was totally out of ideas. Susan's case ultimately went completely cold. Sergeant Hensley retired and 19 years passed by. And then one day, in early 2006, Lieutenant Don Miller of the Stephenville Police Department took a box labeled Susan Woods down from a shelf in evidence storage, carried it back to his office, sat down at his desk, and began to look through its contents. Miller had recently been tasked with reviewing the department's unsolved cases, including Susan's. He read all of Sergeant Hensley's notes. He studied the crime scene photos, and he reviewed all the witness statements. None of it looked very promising. In fact, it looked like all the suspects had basically been ruled out. But then he saw those palm prints that had been lifted from Susan's bathtub, which had never been matched to anyone. And he had an idea. Back in 1987, there had been no centralized database of fingerprints. This meant that unless you had a specific suspect to compare an unknown print against, the unknown print was effectively useless. And that's really what had happened in Susan's case. None of the suspects had matched this unknown print. So, the case was put on a shelf. But in 2006, the FBI now had a national database of all the fingerprints of everybody in America who had ever been arrested and fingerprinted. And this meant that if Susan's killer had ever been arrested for any crime anywhere, their fingerprints would likely be in that database. Now, Lieutenant Miller did not have the budget or the time for a full-blown reinvestigation here. But he certainly had the time and money to just submit those prints into this FBI database to just see if there was a hit. So he submitted them and then put her case file back in storage. And sure enough, a few days later, Miller was at his desk when his phone rang, and it was the FBI, and they told him they had found a match. But when the FBI agent told Miller the name of the person whose prints these matched, it meant nothing to Miller. He didn't think he'd actually even heard the name before, and the person had been arrested for robbery in Nevada, not Texas. Miller thanked the agent, and he quickly began digging through this person's history, and he also went and got the Susan Woods case file. And slowly but surely, it all began to come together. And as Miller read through in her file all the names of the people that Susan spent her time with, he noticed something. And finally, it all just clicked. Lieutenant Miller had found the killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and the killer's written confession, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Susan Woods on the evening of Sunday, July 26th, 1987. Stephenville's main street was busy as the killer drove through town in their brown pickup, sipping a mixture of soda, vodka, and cough syrup. They stared out their window at all the happy people in the restaurants and the storefronts. And as they stared at these people, a darkness stirred inside the killer. This darkness had been there for years, telling the killer they were no good and they would never be close to anyone. Alcohol was the only thing that seemed to make this darkness go away. So, the killer stayed half-drunk most of the time. But sometimes, even the alcohol wasn't enough. A few years back, when the TV news had been running non-stop with talk about devil worshipping, the killer had been sort of inspired, and they thought they might try that. And so, they had lit a bunch of candles and set them around their room in the shape of a pentagram. And then the killer stripped off their clothes. They stretched out on the floor and they offered up their soul to the devil in exchange for freedom from this darkness. But unfortunately, the darkness remained. And so now the killer, feeling very riled up, took another drink and thought of Susan and the way she'd smiled at them the last time they had seen each other. The killer had not had the courage to make a move back then. But now, with this buzz that they had from their drink, they really couldn't see a good reason not to make a pass at Susan. So they turned off the main road, and they drove the short distance to Susan's house. In a matter of minutes, the killer was at her door, knocking. Susan opened the door, and surprise flashed across her face, but then it softened into a smile, and she told them to come on in. Susan told them to get comfortable, and as they sat down on the couch, she went to the kitchen to get the killer a Coke and some snacks. Then she brought them back, and she sat down on the couch next to the killer to talk and catch up. And that was when the killer made their move. They leaned in to kiss her, but Susan immediately pulled back. Suddenly angry, the killer grabbed her and Susan slapped them across the face. And right then, the killer exploded. It would take almost 20 years. But that single action of the killer placing their hands on the bathtub did eventually give Lieutenant Miller the killer's identity. He was the younger cousin of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark. And he was one of the members of that roundtable group who supported Susan through her divorce. He had also been at Susan's funeral and helped her friends through the aftermath of her death. The killer's name was Scott Hatley. And just a week before he killed her, he had been hanging out with the members of the roundtable. And Susan was there. And Susan, who was this, very shy, gentle person, had sort of opened up around this group. She was feeling happier and happier, largely because this group of friends, including Scott, had been so supportive. She really felt like she belonged here and was safe here. And during that meeting amongst the members of the roundtable, just sort of inexplicably, Susan had looked over at Scott and simply smiled at him. And for that reason, pretty much alone, Scott, a week later, had shown up on her doorstep and murdered her. By the time Lieutenant Miller put all of this together, Hatley was 41 years old and was still a free man. And so, on the 7th of June 2006, Miller had him arrested and charged him with Susan's murder. He would ultimately take a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but would only serve 11 years before he was released for good behavior. However, 3 years after Hatley got out of prison, he was found dead inside of his RV from cancer complications. And among his things, investigators would find this handwritten diary where he confessed to Susan's murder. The pages were also filled with references to Satan and demons. And Hatley specifically wrote that some kind of outside presence had been responsible for pushing him to ultimately assault and kill Susan. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In June of 2011, I was in the middle of Navy SEAL training, and to be honest, I was not having a good day. We were doing a particularly brutal underwater test that was designed to weed people out, and it was working. One by one, my classmates were failing. The test involved a lot of breath holding and problem solving, all while instructors were actively trying to make you panic. It was a mental game more than anything, and on that day, my mind just wasn't in it. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, an instructor tapped me out. I had failed. He told me to get out of the pool and go sit with the other failures over in the corner. The walk of shame from the pool to that corner was one of the longest of my life. I climbed out, water streaming from my gear, and trudged over to where the other guys were sitting. They were all lined up in neat rows on the hot concrete, their backs to the pool, staring at a blank wall. It was a picture of defeat. I was totally exhausted from the test, physically and mentally drained, so when I sat down at the end of a row, I started putting on a bit of a show. I began breathing really loud, heaving my chest up and down, making these huge, dramatic sighs. I guess I wanted everyone to know just how hard my test had been, how close I had come, even though I'd failed just like them. About 2 seconds into this ridiculous performance, one of my classmates sitting in front of me turned around. He was a big, quiet kid from Wisconsin, only about 18 years old, named Ephraim Matos. He made direct eye contact with me, his jaw was clenched, and through gritted teeth, he just said, "Shut up. Everybody here is in pain." And then he turned back around to face the wall. For a second, I was furious. He had just called me out in front of everybody. But then, almost immediately, it hit me. He was 100% right. I was acting like a baby, feeling sorry for myself. The job we were trying out for, becoming a Navy SEAL, wasn't for people who wallowed in self-pity. It was about being part of a team, and right then I was only thinking about myself. That simple, direct lesson Ephraim taught me on the pool deck that day stuck with me forever. And 5 years later, the totally insane thing that he would do would stick with me and the rest of the world too. Fast forward about a year, and both Ephraim and I made it through training. We graduated and became Navy SEALs. The teams are split between the East and West Coasts of the United States. I was assigned to an East Coast team, and he was sent out to a West Coast team. As it often happens in the military, our paths never crossed again. For the next 5 years, I didn't see or hear from him at all. That is, until I saw him on the news. It was mid-June of 2017. I was on base in Virginia, sitting in an office with a bunch of other SEALs. We were all wrapping up for the day, closing out emails, powering down computers, just getting ready to head home. My phone was sitting on the desk next to me, and suddenly it just lit up. It started buzzing and vibrating nonstop with text messages from current and former teammates. I picked it up and saw they all said basically the same thing. Turn on the news. Now, in that office, there was always a TV in the corner, and it was always tuned to a major news channel, but the volume was always muted. I looked over at the screen, and all I could make out from a distance was a bright red breaking news banner at the bottom and some words about the Middle East. Given our profession, that kind of news usually had a direct impact on our lives. It could mean a canceled vacation or a deployment getting moved up. So I figured all the texts were about whatever was happening over there. I got up, walked over to the TV, grabbed the remote, and started turning the volume up as I walked back to my desk. Everyone else in the room turned their attention to the screen as well. The news anchor started talking about a small group of American civilians. These weren't soldiers, they were just regular citizens who had decided to go to Iraq to take up arms and fight against the terrorist organization ISIS. As the anchor was explaining this, an image popped up on the screen. It was a picture of a big, bearded guy in his mid-20s. He was wearing tactical gear, carrying an AK-47 rifle, and standing behind a tank somewhere in the desert. The second I saw that picture, I knew exactly why my phone had been blowing up. We all knew that guy. The man on the TV was Ephraim Matos. After we had graduated from SEAL training 5 years earlier, Ephraim had checked into his first SEAL team on the West Coast. Very quickly, his team was deployed to Afghanistan. During one of their missions, his patrol was walking across a huge open field after leaving a village they had just cleared. Ephraim was assigned to rear security, which meant his job was to be the last man in the formation and watch their backs, making sure no one was following them or trying to ambush them from behind. So, every few seconds, Ephraim would turn around, scan the area behind the patrol, and then turn back. During one of these scans, he saw something that made his blood run cold. 2 little girls, who couldn't have been more than 5 and 7 years old, were running out of the village, sprinting down the road directly towards his team. Now, earlier that day, while they were in that same village, the team had found a children's backpack just lying in the middle of a road. When they went to inspect it, they discovered it was an IED, a homemade bomb rigged to explode. They had defused it and no one was hurt, but the entire team was now extremely wary of children carrying backpacks. And as Ephraim watched these 2 little girls running towards him, he could see they were both wearing backpacks very similar to the one they had found earlier. They were being used as suicide bombers. Ephraim immediately started screaming at them in the local language. He yelled for them to stop, to go back, telling them not to come any closer or he would have to shoot. But they just kept running. He could see their faces now. Tears were streaming down their cheeks. They looked terrified. They were just innocent kids who had been forced into this by the Taliban. But Ephraim's job was to protect his team, and that meant he had to treat them as a threat. When they wouldn't stop, he had no choice. He raised his rifle, flipped the safety selector from safe to fire, and put his optic right on the center of the older girl's chest. He began to apply slow, steady pressure to the trigger. But right at the last second, just as he was about to fire the shot, the girls just abruptly stopped. It was as if they suddenly understood what was about to happen. They turned around and ran back towards the village as fast as they could. Ephraim took his finger off the trigger, flipped the safety back on, and lowered his rifle. He let out a huge sigh of relief. He hadn't had to shoot two little girls. But even though the immediate danger was over, that experience haunted him. Of all the combat he saw on that deployment, of all the firefights and explosions, that moment with those innocent children had the most profound impact on him. He couldn't stop thinking about it. How could anyone be so cruel? How could any human being force a child to become a walking bomb? By the time Ephraim returned to the United States after that deployment, he was a different person. That experience had fundamentally changed him. He still believed in what the U.S. government was trying to do in the Middle East, but he felt like it wasn't enough. He felt a deep personal need to do more for the innocent people, like those two little girls who were trapped in the middle of these brutal conflicts. So, over the next few years, he started researching different conflict zones around the world. He was looking for the places where civilians were in the most danger, where the atrocities were the worst. And he found one place that stood out above all others. It was Iraq, where a new and unbelievably violent terrorist organization called ISIS had taken control of huge swaths of the country. So, in early 2017, when Ephraim's contract with the Navy was up, he had a choice to make. He could re-enlist and stay in the SEAL teams, or he could get out and become a civilian. He chose to get out. But he didn't go look for a normal job. Instead, he got on social media and started looking for groups that were helping people in Iraq. He found a foreign volunteer group that was providing humanitarian aid to civilians caught in the crossfire. He sent them a message, explained his background, and asked if he could join them. Of course, they were thrilled. The idea of having a former Navy SEAL on their team was a huge asset. They said yes, immediately. Just a couple of days later, Ephraim sold his house, packed a single bag of clothes into a backpack, grabbed his passport, and got on a plane to northern Iraq. He went completely by himself. Now, it's really important to understand just how incredibly bold and dangerous this move was. When Ephraim was a Navy SEAL on active duty in Afghanistan, he had the full might of the United States military behind him. If his team got pinned down by the enemy, they could call in an airstrike from a jet or a gunship that would obliterate the enemy's position. They could call for a quick reaction force, a team of reinforcements that would come and help them fight their way out. If Ephraim or one of his teammates got hurt, they could call for a medevac helicopter. These were specialized medical teams that would fly into almost any situation under heavy fire to rescue them and provide life-saving care. And if, in the worst-case scenario, Ephraim got captured by the enemy, he could be sure that America was coming for him. The entire military and intelligence community would be mobilized to get him back. But now, Ephraim was going to a war zone as a civilian. He wasn't in the U.S. military anymore. He had none of that support. None of it. If his new team of volunteers got pinned down, they had to fight their way out or die. There were no airstrikes to call. If he or one of his teammates got hurt, they would have to save themselves. There was no medevac helicopter coming for them. And if Ephraim got captured by ISIS as a civilian, nobody was coming for him. In fact, nobody would even officially know he was gone. He would just disappear. He was completely, totally on his own. Ephraim knew all of these risks. He knew them better than almost anyone because he had been in a war zone before and had seen how critical that support structure was. But he just didn't care. He felt a calling. He had to go help these innocent people because he felt like nobody else was. When he landed in Iraq in March of 2017, he was met at the airport by a member of the volunteer group. The guy was a very muscular, tattooed American in his mid-30s who introduced himself as Sky. He told Ephraim he had been a Marine and had deployed to Iraq before, so he knew the area well. The two of them got into a vehicle, and Sky drove them to the group's safe house in the city. There, Ephraim met the leader of the organization. He was a tough-as-nails former Army Special Forces soldier in his mid-50s named Dave. Dave had been doing this kind of work for decades, going to conflict zones all over the world to provide aid. He told Ephraim that of all the places he had ever been, the worst atrocities he had ever seen committed against civilians were happening right there, in Iraq, at the hands of ISIS. A few days later, Ephraim, Sky, Dave, and a few other American volunteers packed up. They loaded into a convoy of armored ambulances and left the city, heading west into the countryside. Their destination was the outskirts of a huge city called Mosul, which had been captured by ISIS 3 years earlier and had become their stronghold. The journey was tense. To get to Mosul, they had to pass through a number of military checkpoints. Most of these were run by their allies, the Iraqi army. But they all knew that at any moment they could round a corner and stumble upon a checkpoint run by ISIS. As pale-skinned Americans, they would be instantly identified as the enemy and would be in a fight for their lives. So every time their convoy slowed down for a checkpoint, Ephraim and the others would grip their rifles tightly, their knuckles white, mentally preparing for a sudden, vicious, close-quarters gunfight. But luckily, they made it the entire way to the edge of Mosul without any major incidents. Once there, they linked up with a unit of the Iraqi army that Dave, the group's leader, had built a relationship with. For the first month Ephraim was in the country, his work was what he had expected. He and the other volunteers worked alongside this Iraqi army unit to distribute food, water, and provide basic medical care to the thousands of civilians who were living in refugee camps in and around Mosul. But in the second month, everything changed. The Iraqi government and its allies decided it was finally time to launch the massive military operation to retake the city of Mosul from ISIS. This was a huge undertaking. It involved multiple army units and was expected to take weeks, if not months. The main force of the Iraqi army was tasked with pushing directly into the city limits, fighting block by block to reclaim territory. Meanwhile, the specific Iraqi army unit that Ephraim and his volunteer group were embedded with was given a different mission. They were an armored unit, and their job was to reclaim these smaller villages surrounding Mosul that ISIS had also occupied. And so, just like that, Ephraim and his team went from being humanitarian aid workers to having a direct, frontline combat role. In his very first combat experience as a civilian, Ephraim found himself running across an active minefield towards an ISIS-occupied village. He said he nearly got blown up at least twice. After making it across the field, he and the other volunteers began going from house to house, clearing them of any ISIS fighters. He actually has this part on camera. In one house, he and Dave entered a small structure and saw a couple of guns on the ground, but no fighters. They looked around and noticed a loose piece of plywood on the floor. When they moved it aside, it revealed a dark hole leading down into the ground. It was an entrance to a huge underground tunnel system that ISIS used to move around undetected and to escape from gunfights just like this one. Without hesitating, Ephraim and Dave just dropped right down into the tunnel. They didn't have night vision goggles. They didn't have any backup. It was just the two of them in a pitch-black tunnel under enemy territory. They started moving down the dark corridor, periodically throwing grenades ahead of them just in case any fighters were waiting in ambush. After moving for a while, they reached a large, high-ceilinged cavern that seemed to be a dead end. They were looking around, thinking maybe no one had come down there after all. But before they turned to leave, they shined their flashlights up towards the ceiling. And there, high up on the wall, they saw another entrance to another tunnel. It was dug into the rock, far too high to reach without a ladder. Ephraim and Dave looked at each other. They figured the ISIS fighters had run down here, used a ladder to climb up into that second tunnel, and then pulled the ladder up after them so no one could follow. There was nothing more they could do down there, so they climbed out of the tunnel system and went back outside. They told the Iraqi army commander what they had found. A few minutes later, the Iraqis brought in a bulldozer and completely filled in the tunnel entrance inside the house, sealing it shut. Later that night, after the village was fully secured, they started hearing muffled explosions coming from underground near where that house was. It turned out to be the ISIS fighters they had been chasing. They had realized they were trapped and had been buried alive, so they detonated their suicide vests. For the next month, Ephraim and the Iraqi unit he was with continued to get into small skirmishes with ISIS in the villages outside Mosul. But most of their time was still spent providing medical care and humanitarian aid to the civilians they encountered. Then, in May, their mission changed again. The other Iraqi army units that had been pushing into the city of Mosul itself had made good progress, but they had hit a wall. The last remaining ISIS fighters had been pushed into a northern section of the city. There, they had bunkered down inside heavily fortified, bombed-out concrete buildings. and they were putting up an unbelievably fierce fight. The Iraqi units in the city were taking heavy casualties and couldn't advance any further. They needed armored vehicles and tanks to break the stalemate. And it just so happened that the army unit Ephraim and his volunteer group were with was an armored unit. They were the ones with the tanks. So they got the order. They were to move into the heart of Mosul and help liberate the city once and for all. On May 4th, Ephraim and the other volunteers loaded into their armored vehicles and joined a massive column of dozens and dozens of tanks and other armored vehicles. They were staged on the western side of Mosul, with just an open field between them and the city. The moment that massive convoy started rolling forward, the city just erupted. Heavy machine gun fire, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortars started raining down on them. It was absolute chaos. ISIS knew they were coming and were throwing everything they had at the advancing column. Ephraim said that as soon as his vehicle crossed into the city limits and was on one of the main roads, car bombs that had been hidden along the street started detonating all around them. The machine gun and rocket fire only intensified. At the same time, Iraqi civilians who were still trapped inside Mosul saw this huge battle erupting and began trying to flee the city. But ISIS had been holding them hostage, using them as human shields to prevent large-scale bombing. So when the ISIS fighters saw the civilians trying to escape, they started shooting them in the back, gunning them down in the streets to scare others from trying to run. Right in front of Ephraim, as his vehicle drove deeper into the city, he saw men, women, and children being massacred. Without a second thought, Ephraim and the other volunteers jumped out of their vehicle and tried to return fire at the ISIS snipers, but the fighters were so well hidden in the rubble and the destroyed buildings that they couldn't even see them, let alone hit them. So they did the next best thing. Ephraim and the others started deliberately putting themselves out in the open, running from cover to cover to draw the enemy's fire onto themselves. This created a distraction, giving nearby civilians a chance to run to safety. For the next 3 days, that's what they did. They were constantly exposing themselves, dodging bullets, and when they weren't doing that, they were treating wounded civilians and Iraqi soldiers right there on the front lines. Up to this point, Ephraim had seen combat as a Navy SEAL and as a volunteer. But it wasn't until he got inside Mosul that he truly saw how barbaric human beings could be to one another. He said he saw so much death and destruction around him that it felt like his brain couldn't even process it. He would later write a book about his experience and call it The City of Death, because that's exactly what it felt like. Everywhere he looked, there was just death. For the next several weeks, Ephraim and the other volunteers took up a position in a bombed-out building in the southern section of Mosul. They turned it into a makeshift aid station and focused all their energy on treating as many wounded civilians and soldiers as they could. Meanwhile, the main Iraqi army force was slowly pushing north, chipping away at the last ISIS strongholds. On June 1st, almost a month after they had entered the city, Ephraim and his team noticed a huge increase in the number of wounded civilians coming to their aid station. All day and all night, a steady stream of people came in, horribly wounded with gunshot wounds and shrapnel injuries. Ephraim and the others started asking them what had happened. This was unusual, to see so many people wounded at once. But most of the civilians were in a state of shock and couldn't really explain what they had been through. A few of them mentioned that there had been a massacre nearby, but because of the language barrier and the sheer number of patients they had to treat, they couldn't get any more details. The following morning, Ephraim and the other volunteers decided they needed to find out what happened. They were going to push farther north into ISIS-held territory to see if they could find any evidence of this supposed massacre. So Ephraim and his team left their aid station and moved north about 1 block until they reached a huge intersection. They took cover behind a massive concrete wall that protected them from ISIS sniper fire. The main ISIS position was down the other road that ran through the intersection. The fighters were holed up in a huge, bombed-out hospital that overlooked the entire area. From where Ephraim and his team were, behind the wall, ISIS couldn't see them or shoot at them. At one point, Ephraim carefully poked his head around the edge of the wall to look down the road towards the hospital. What he saw shocked him to his core. The road was littered with bodies. Dozens and dozens of dead civilians were lying all over the street. It turned out that the day before, a huge group of civilians had made a desperate attempt to flee the city. They had to run right in front of that hospital, and the ISIS fighters inside had just opened fire on them, gunning them all down. They killed over 200 people, men, women, and children, and they wounded at least 100 more. That was why there had been such a huge wave of wounded people at their aid station the day before. As Ephraim scanned this scene of absolute carnage, being careful not to expose himself for too long, his eyes landed on one particularly large pile of bodies. There were maybe 20 or 30 people in this pile, and then he saw movement. He could clearly see a little girl trying to hide herself underneath her dead mother's clothes. Next to her, he saw 2 adult men who were also alive, but clearly wounded. Ephraim immediately started yelling to them, trying to get them to run towards his position, telling them they were going to get killed if they stayed out there. But the 3 of them were completely shell-shocked. They had been lying in that pile of bodies for the past 24 hours. They were not capable of moving on their own. Ephraim knew that unless he and his team did something, those 3 people were going to die. So Ephraim and the others ran back to their Iraqi army partners and quickly came up with a rescue plan. An Iraqi tank would drive down the road straight towards the ISIS-held hospital. Following right behind the tank, using it as a shield, would be an Iraqi Humvee. Inside the Humvee would be Ephraim and the other volunteers. The tank would drive past the pile of bodies, and the Humvee would pull up right alongside it. Ephraim and the others would jump out, grab the little girl and the 2 men, pull them into the Humvee, and then both vehicles would back up to safety. It was a risky plan, but it was the only option they had. Once the plan was in place, Ephraim and Dave contacted the American military forces in the area. They managed to get them to authorize a smoke screen. The U.S. would fire artillery shells that would burst in the air over the road, releasing smoke grenades that would create a thick cloud, obscuring the view of the ISIS fighters in the hospital. They wouldn't be able to see the rescue operation happening right in front of them. Shortly after all the plans were finalized, Ephraim and the others were loading up into their designated Humvee, getting ready to start the operation. But then, the Iraqi driver of the Humvee suddenly said he wasn't going to do it. He said it was too dangerous and he wasn't willing to risk his life. Ephraim and his team pleaded with him. They tried to convince him to go, explaining that they didn't have time to find a replacement driver. The American artillery was scheduled to fire the smoke screen at a specific time. If they missed that window, they wouldn't get another chance. Not to mention, the 3 survivors in the street were running out of time. But the driver wouldn't budge. Realizing they were getting nowhere, Ephraim and the others got out of the Humvee. They walked up to the Iraqi tank that was supposed to lead the mission and spoke to the tank driver. They asked him if he was still willing to go. He said yes. And so, even though it meant they would now have to run on foot behind the tank, completely exposed, they decided to go through with the mission anyway. Ephraim said that at no point did they even consider canceling. They were so focused on saving those 3 people that they were all prepared to die to do it. The tank driver closed his hatch. Ephraim, Dave, and the other volunteers got in position behind the massive vehicle. The tank lurched forward and turned the corner, facing directly down the road towards the hospital. A few moments later, as planned, the American artillery shells burst overhead and a thick white smoke screen filled the air. As soon as the smoke appeared, ISIS knew something was happening. They just started firing blindly down the road, spraying bullets and rockets into the smoke. Meanwhile, Ephraim and the others were huddled behind the slow-moving tank as rounds impacted all around them. Mortars began to land nearby, shaking the ground. It turned out there were ISIS fighters not just in the hospital ahead of them, but also in buildings off to their side, so they were getting shot at from 2 directions. Ephraim remembers being so terrified as he ran behind that tank that he started to dry heave. He was completely convinced that he was going to die. Eventually, the tank rolled just past the pile of bodies. At that moment, Ephraim stepped out from behind the tank and started firing his rifle towards the hospital and the other buildings, providing cover fire. While he was shooting, Dave and another volunteer ran over to the pile, pulled the little girl and the 2 men out, and dragged them behind the tank. The girl and one of the men were mostly okay physically, but the other man was badly wounded and couldn't walk. Thinking quickly, the team found a loose piece of sheet metal on the ground and rolled the man onto it, using it as a makeshift stretcher. They started dragging him as the tank began to slowly move in reverse, back towards safety. Bullets were still flying everywhere. As they were making progress, the wounded man suddenly slipped off the sheet metal and landed directly in the path of the tank's tracks. And because they had no way to communicate with the driver, the tank was just going to keep moving and run him over. Without thinking, Ephraim leaped forward, grabbed the injured man, and rolled with him out of the way just as the massive steel track went past them. But now, Ephraim and the wounded man were out from behind the protection of the tank. The smoke screen was starting to clear, and ISIS could see them. Rounds started impacting the ground all around them. At that moment, Ephraim had to make a heartbreaking decision. He looked at the wounded man, who he knew couldn't move on his own. He made eye contact with him, held his hand for a second, and just shook his head and said, "I'm sorry." He knew he couldn't move him fast enough or throw him over his shoulder in time before they both got shot. He had to leave him. So Ephraim jumped up and dove back behind the tank, just as a burst of machine gun fire tore up the spot where he had been standing. The wounded man would be killed by ISIS moments later. As Ephraim and the others continued to retreat behind the tank, he suddenly felt a sharp, searing pain in his right leg and fell to the ground. He had been shot, and where he fell was, again, right in the path of the tank's track. But a huge surge of adrenaline hit him. He somehow managed to leap back onto his feet, and, despite the gaping hole in his leg, he continued to hobble behind the tank. Eventually, they made it all the way back to the intersection where they had started. But to get to the alleyway where the rest of the Iraqi army was waiting, they had to cross a small, open section of street. It would only take a second to run across, but by now the smoke was gone, and ISIS snipers were waiting for them to pop out from behind the tank. Ephraim and the others started screaming at the Iraqi soldiers across the street, trying to get them to send an armored vehicle to pick them up. But with the noise of the tank's engine and all the gunfire, the message just wasn't getting through. And then, in a sudden fit of madness and frustration and fear, Ephraim just took off. He ran across the open street, and miraculously, he made it to the other side without getting hit again. He yelled at the Iraqi soldiers, told them what was happening, and seconds later, an armored Humvee sped across the gap, picked up the rest of the volunteers, the surviving man, and the little girl, and brought them back to safety. Ephraim was now lying on the ground behind the concrete wall, finally safe, as someone bandaged his leg. He remembers that when the little girl and the man were brought to safety, the Iraqi soldiers all erupted in cheers. It was this one unbelievably happy moment in the middle of a horrible, tragic day. The Iraqis put Ephraim in an armored ambulance and took him to an aid station south of the city. There, a doctor rebandaged his leg and then left him on a cot to rest. As Ephraim lay there, thinking about what had just happened, he looked over to his left. Just 2 beds away from him was the little girl he had just nearly died to save. She was sitting on her cot, just staring straight ahead into nothingness. Her dark hair was matted with dirt. She was clearly still in shock, but she looked physically unhurt. A few minutes later, an Iraqi doctor came over and gave her some food and water, and she ate and drank like she hadn't had anything in days. Ephraim just stared at her. At that moment, she was the most important thing in his life. The doctor who had given her the food noticed Ephraim looking, and he walked over. He just smiled and said, "Her name is Demoa. She's 4 years old, and she's going to be just fine." After the doctor walked away, Ephraim pulled his hat down over his face, and he just wept. Ephraim never got a chance to actually speak to Demoa. She was so scared of everyone around her that he decided it was best to just give her space. But he would later find out that she was safely reunited with her surviving family members, and today she is alive and well. After his injury, Ephraim was sent back to the United States to recover. It was only then that he learned that the entire rescue operation had been filmed. A journalist who was there that day documenting ISIS war crimes had seen the rescue happening and had just started recording. After he posted the footage online, it went viral. Before long, major news outlets from all over the world were reaching out to Ephraim and the other volunteers for interviews. This was the story that me and my teammates saw on the news in that office in Virginia back in 2017. That picture of Ephraim standing behind the tank with an AK-47, that was taken moments before he rushed out to provide cover fire for his friends. The gunshot wound to Ephraim's leg ended up being relatively minor as far as gunshot wounds go. The bullet had passed clean through without hitting a major artery or shattering the bone. After a few months of recovery, he was more or less back to full strength. But he didn't take it easy. Soon, he was in another conflict zone, this time in Burma, working with a new volunteer organization. It was one that he founded himself, called Stronghold Rescue and Relief. Their mission is simple: to protect and care for families trapped in conflict zones. Their motto is, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Despite being a very small organization, they are having an enormous impact all over the world. But they rely on donations to keep their operations going. If you're a fan of this channel, please consider supporting them. The link to their website is in the description of this video. There, you can also see the full, unedited footage of the rescue mission we talked about today. It's truly incredible to watch. What Ephraim and his team did that day is a testament to the power of courage and compassion in the face of unimaginable darkness. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.